That's the case, and I won't hold it.
Hello. Now she can hear. Good morning. Hey, everybody. Hey. Okay, so and I haven't been doing a good job on keeping everybody on time, and so I'm going to improve myself today. So we're going to start on time, and we're going to start our next speaker on time too. So anyway, welcome. Glad y'all are here virtually and in person. And just one thing that I want to address, I'm going to send y'all an email about this so you'll have it in print. But I guess there's been some confusion on when you count your drive time and miles, and that is only for service. So for this training and for advanced training, you don't. So the way if it starts with like when you do the drop down menu, if there's an AT, that would be no. And pretty much everything. And what do y'all count this against? Initial training. Okay. I don't know what that starts with. IT. Oh, okay. All right. So either AT or IT, that would be no. For most everything else, it's going to be a yes. And there's probably some exceptions, but anyway, that's my rule of thumb. So, and I'll send y'all something about that in an email. And we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, our first speaker is Ron Diderich. He was born in Wisconsin on a dairy farm, moved to Texas in 1985, so he got here as soon as he could. He started building a house on the shore of Lake Livingston in '99. Have you completed that house?
No, I'll never get it done.
All right then. Okay. And for anybody who didn't hear that, he said he'll never be done. Okay. He has degrees from the.
It depends. If I become unmarried, I may get it done.
Oh. Okay. He said if he becomes unmarried, he may get it done. I'm thinking that's more unlikely than the. Okay. Degrees from the University of Illinois, University of Rhode Island, and University of Michigan. He's currently co-president of the Piney Woods Lakes chapter of the Texas Master Naturalist and treasurer of the Friends of Lake Livingston. He started studying water resources in Texas with emphasis on Lake Livingston when he moved to the shore and realized that there was much to learn about water in Texas. So welcome, Ron.
It feels funny holding a microphone. When I moved up to Lake Livingston, actually I was looking at Lake Conroe first, but you guys want way too much money for me. I couldn't afford to come here, so I went to Livingston, which was a lot cheaper. And when I'd sit down on the porch that I built, which is one of the first things I did, sitting on a rocking chair, looking out over the lake, thinking big thoughts, I started realizing that I had a lot of questions about what was going on out there. You know, what was in the lake, how did the lake get there, the history of it, the chemistry, the physical characteristics. And over the last, what's it been, 13 years or so since I started with Master Naturalist, I used the Master Naturalist program as a springboard to kind of learn more about water resources with, as I said, specific emphasis on the lake that I was looking at out in front of my house. And over the years, I've uncovered a few things. which I'm going to share with you today, will cover some of the basics of water resources, but I'm going to branch out frequently from the basics, sometimes specific to Lake Livingston, sometimes specific to other areas, just to show you a little bit about the path that I've taken over the last few years, and maybe give you some ideas or some interest for yourselves. One of the things when you go into something like this, you find that Aristotle was right. Aristotle was definitely correct when he said, the more you know you don't know. So every time I would answer a question, I would come up with 10 more questions that related to it. And some of the stuff got to be difficult for me behind my comprehension because it was so complicated. But I keep working at it. Every year I learn a little bit more. And if I live long enough, I might even someday become an expert. I doubt it. See if it works. Oops, gotta remember I have a microphone. I call this water everywhere. In the prior video that was put together by NASA a couple of years ago, shows that the amount of water that we're dealing with is really relatively small. It's not that huge of a thing. And the problem we have with water is in a lot of places around the world, water is either not where it needs to be, for example, agriculture, or it's polluted. So we end up with a situation where we're dealing with water shortages on a worldwide basis. Interestingly enough, most of us still consider water to be free. That there's no cost to water. When we pay our water bill, what we're paying for is the infrastructure to bring the water to our house. And the strange thing about it, and I read this in a book that I'll show in a second. The strange thing about it is we spend a lot of money gathering up this water, treating it, purifying it, routing it to our house, bringing it through our plumbing, and then we pee in it. It just doesn't make any sense. Just doesn't make any sense what we're doing with water. And we need to, I think, start realizing that water is a precious resource. And looking at water resources is really, really quite important, in my opinion. The last video had some statistics buried in it. I don't know if you noticed them, that 97% of the water. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. There was one other thing. Back when we were all nomads, the original people, when the water would dry up somewhere or move or become polluted, we would move. We would follow, and generally the civilization settled around water and built up around water, and it would relocate as water changed. As the water locations changed, the people changed. Now we've got so much invested in infrastructure that we no longer are able to easily do that. So the issue of water will continue to be something that we need to pay attention to. Now, the statistics on the prior slide says 97% of the water is in the ocean, and less than 1% is water that's available for drinking use. That comes from this graph. This graph shows up all over the place. And in fact, it's the only one I can find that deals with those statistics. And it's referred to constantly by different other presentations. So what you've got here is it says that the oceans are 96.5% of the water, fresh water is 2.5%. And if you look at the fresh water, 2/3 of it is in glaciers and ice caps, and almost another third is in groundwater, and only a small amount is the surface, another freshwater. There's that 1% that was in the video. If you go down and look at that 1%, you see a fair amount of that is not really all that accessible. And then you've got lakes and rivers and swamps and atmosphere. You know, if you look at this, we look at, say, lakes, it's 20% of 1% of 2.5%. So if you start doing the math, you start seeing that you're at a decimal point, decimal 0.00. The amount of water that we have available to us, at least surface water, is a relatively tiny amount of the total water that's on Earth. But let's look at something on the slide. There's something that's on the slide. Look when this was done. This slide was done almost 30 years ago. It was done by a Russian scientist, and he did it based upon a number of assumptions. He didn't go out and actually take his measuring cup out and start measuring water all over the world. He drew conclusions based upon a number of assumptions that he's made about water. And this was done in 1993. As far as I know, it's the only one that I've ever seen. This is the definitive source of this bit of statistics. And guess what? In 30 years, even if he was right 30 years ago, it's probably a little bit off now. But it does give you the gist of the situation. And that is that there is a lot of water out there, but we have trouble figuring out how to put it to use. Tyrannosaurus Rex. Why would I put this up there? The answer is there's several memes out there actually that you can come across that says we're all drinking dinosaur pee. And what that's saying is that the amount of water in the world is unchanging. It just goes through cycles, and it goes from one place to another and then back and then another place and so on. You have the water cycle, like I've got up over there in a poster, that's moving the water from one place to another, but it's the same water. If you look at the Trinity River, I saw a statistic that if you were to take a drop of water and follow that drop, isolate that drop, and follow that drop down the river, it will leave the river 19 times and come back into the river. So we're using the water and it's putting it back, but the total amount of water is staying the same. False. That's not true. That's just not true. Where did all this water come from originally? For those of you that believe in Genesis and study the Bible, when God created the earth and the heavens, water was there, was already there. You know, on day 2 is when he separated the water from the land. So he didn't specifically create the water, it just came as part of the earth. That's the biblical interpretation. If you look at the astronomers, they say that the water came from asteroids hitting Earth. And the asteroids had water in them, and the accumulation of water on Earth came from the asteroids. The University of Texas, oh gosh, I guess it's been maybe 15 years ago now, said that no, there's probably another explanation. And that is, if you look at the mantle of the Earth, there's a lot of hydrous oxide and hydrogen, free hydrogen. And if you combine those two, you get H2O. And what happened, they think, is that the volcanic eruptions, which freed them from the temperature and pressures of the Earth's mantle, caused them to combine into water, and that's where our water came from, was actually from the volcanic eruptions. And it's still going on. Not only in volcanoes, but as the Earth's plates shift around the globe, you have magma escaping where those plates join up, and that is releasing OH and H and creating water. And there's also, you know, I won't go into too much more, but if you take a look at the hydrocarbons that we're burning, one of the byproducts is water. So we're changing oil and gas into water as well as we go along. So the total amount of water is not fixed, but if you look at the scale and the magnitude of things, there's not a whole lot of change going on a day-to-day, year-to-year, century-to-century basis. Here's the only book that I reference, and I really like this book because it talks about what communities have done around the world when they've come up with a lack of water, when they've ran out of water. Included in this, for example, is Las Vegas. Las Vegas is, as you probably know, is built in a desert and has had huge population growth, and they don't have enough water to support the population there. So they have started using gray water, recycled gray water, to supplement the fresh water, using orange pipes as a separate distribution system to do that. A lot of the fountains now are recycled water in Las Vegas. In Pennsylvania, a town well ran dry, and what they did for a period of time was truck water in. And they soon realized that water was precious when they have to pay for trucking it in all the time. A lot of water resource planning in Australia. There are some dry areas in Australia that have struggled with water, and they too are reusing gray water as their first effort. This book talks about that, and it's a really quite interesting, easily readable book. Okay, first quiz. I'm going to stand here until someone raises their hand and answers. Okay? All of the above. Whenever you're taking a test, if there's all of the above, always choose it. It's always going to be correct. The question is, where do we get the water we need to flush our toilets? Surface water, groundwater, rainfall capture, salt water, other. All of those are true. Maybe not the best use of some of those, but certainly we have many different sources of water. When we look at water resources, we need to consider all of these. Okay, here's another, there are hundreds of water cycle illustrations, including the one that we use for our training of grade school kids. The water recycle is, this has most of the terms in it, so I like this one. You know, we think of it as evaporation. In our case, evaporation off the Gulf of Mexico, we think of it. And that it forms clouds, and the clouds go over the land, and it rains on the land in the form of precipitation, which comes from the condensation in the clouds. And once the precipitation comes down, it either runs off on the surface or infiltrates to the groundwater, or at least to the water table. In the stuff that does not infiltrate, you have evaporation from the lakes and rivers, you got transpiration coming from the vegetation. And then eventually the surface runoff, it goes back to the Gulf and completes the cycle. You know, that's what they teach us in school. Question I have is, I can see that there are some smaller cycles on that chart. If you look at it, I've got precipitation and evaporation. Precipitation comes down, evaporation goes up. So I've got a cycle, I've got a mini cycle there within the big cycle. How much of the water that's falling on us in the form of rain actually originated in the Gulf of Mexico?
Or it's been there once, but it's not there all the time.
All of the above?
It's interesting because I came across this. Whoops, I got another quiz, sorry. I forgot to have that in there. If I have a half-acre yard, and we're talking about precipitation now. If I have a half-acre yard and I have 1 inch of rainfall, how many gallons of water is that? There's no all of the above.
Probably D.
D is correct. If you're going to capture water, there's an awful lot of water that's available for capture coming down in the form of rain, especially in the east side of Texas. You know, we get, in this area, we get between 50 and 60 inches of rain a year, sometimes a week. Here's the one that I found very fascinating. If I take a look at the rainfall precipitation, I got 379 million acre feet per year. This is over the entire state of Texas. If I look at that 379 acre feet, 320 million of it, or a very large percentage of it, goes in that short cycle that I was talking about. It goes right back up into the sky. Now this varies. If you look at a city, you get an altogether different set of statistics if you isolate to a city, but this is over the entire state. And over the entire state, the bulk of the water that's coming from the atmosphere last originated in the trees and grasses. Trees and grasses are good for water resources, by the way. If I take a look at the amount, the difference would be what, 59 million acre feet, you know, goes into the surface water. Some of that then goes down into groundwater, only 5 million of the 379 million. So relatively small amount of the water that's in our water cycle is ending up in the groundwater. If I take a look at how much goes to the Texas coast, 35 million, or a little less than 10% of the rainfall, the annual rainfall, goes back to the Gulf. Well, conversely, if we're not drowning in water, all of us, that means it's in balance. So that means equally that of roughly 10% of the precipitation originates in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I know when we watch the weather forecasts on television, we all think that it's 100% is coming from the Gulf, but that's just not so. A lot of the rainfall that we're getting is rain that's just being recycled in the natural way between the grasses and trees and the sky. What's this mean? Remind me later.
May I ask a question, please?
Yeah, by the way, I should have said that at the beginning. I would like to take questions while I have slides up, because a lot of times they relate to the slide that's up, so it saves me having to go back and find the slide.
Okay, so I see in the bottom right-hand corner that 85% flows out of state.
Correct.
Would that be down the Sabine, down into the Mississippi?
You know, 9 goes into other states. So the rest of it, if we look at the rivers, and I've got a picture of it in a few slides down the road, most of it's going into the Gulf of Mexico. Almost all of the rivers in Texas flow into the Gulf.
Okay, so does that 85% include what flows into the Gulf of Mexico?
It's almost exclusively what goes into the Gulf of Mexico.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
How much, when you say what's going into the groundwater, has that changed significantly over the years based on development and or concrete?
Yes. Concrete is it's a nasty thing when I talk about cities a little bit. If I were to ask you, what's the #1 source of CO2 in the atmosphere, you all would probably get the right answer to that. And that's transportation. What's #2?
Concrete?
Concrete, exactly. Concrete is the #2 producer of CO2 in the world. Yes, sir.
Okay, so it shows there 5 million is being recharged into the groundwater. What was it 100 years ago? Was it significantly different? Is it twice or is it?
I don't know. I have not seen, this slide is fairly unique and it's hard to find. What the history has been, I don't know. I do know that groundwater recharge is impacted by paving. It's also impacted by clear cutting in agriculture and other things that encourage runoff. It needs to sit. And it needs long roots that go down into the recharge zones. So I'll talk a little bit about it, groundwater down the way here, but it's groundwater is generally diminishing over time. So the answer to your question, either A, not as much of the rainfall is getting into the ground, or B, we're sucking too much out, or C, all of the above. Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of a weird question, but okay, so.
Does it require a weird answer?
And maybe, I don't know. Is it possible to make water? Is there anybody trying to make water so that, you know?
You can make water. You can certainly make it from hydrocarbons if you want to do that, burn it. Generally, the way that people get water is they take water that's not usable and make it usable, either by treatment or, in the case of salt water, by reverse osmosis. The issue with reverse osmosis is for every gallon of water, it takes 15 gallons of source to get one gallon of reverse osmosis water. And the water has to be under very high pressure, which requires pumps, which require a lot of energy, which may or may not come from renewable sources. I love this slide, by the way.
Well, look at that.
I'm gonna do two things here. I'm gonna break this up into surface water and groundwater. And the reason that I separate the two of them is the issues are quite different for the two of them, even though we're dealing with water. How the water is used and what the planning needs to be done is quite different. And two, your other speaker this morning is going to talk more about groundwater, so I'll probably skip a little bit on that because he does a better job than I do. He's very, if it's the same one as last year, he's very good. Oh, another quiz. Oh, this one? Okay. You smart people are going to figure this one out, aren't you? If one of the choices, it depends, always choose that. Okay, who owns the water? It depends on what water you're talking about.
Right. Is it now?
In the case of water that never touches navigable water, if the water is on the surface and it does not interact with a navigable stream, then the landowner owns that water. For example, if I catch the water in a cistern, it's mine. I own it. Not the people of Texas, not the state of Texas, I own it because I captured it before it touched the navigable stream. Now, you say, oh, wait a minute. What's a navigable stream? If you look at maps of navigable streams, and these are available, I forget where I saw it, but you know, every little natural ditch is on that map. The navigable stream doesn't have to be navigable year round. The way I describe it is once in a while, it needs to be able to float a canoe. And then it becomes a navigable stream, even if it's only after a big rainstorm in the spring. So for the most part, once the water hits the ground and starts running, it's going to quickly become owned by the people of Texas, with the state of Texas managing it in trust for the people. Now, that's surface water. Groundwater is an altogether different animal. And who owns the groundwater in Texas? We have the law of capture. The groundwater in Texas is owned by the landowner above the groundwater. So I own everything that I'm standing on, and I can use it for, quote, according to the laws, I can use it for my own purposes. It's not supposed to leave my property if I pump it up. I'm not supposed to waste it. I'm not supposed to do something to harm somebody else. But I can use it for agriculture. I can use it for household use. I can use it for drinking. And I have a right in Texas to do that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, and our other speaker is actually better at it. Who manages? Yes, sir.
So on that question, water is a communication groundwater. So what are the limits on how much you can pull out of water? On your piece of land?
There are no limits. The only limits are you have to use the water that you pull out yourself. You can't bottle it and ship it off. You can't use it for fracking. You can't put it in trucks and send it to the fracking fields in the Permian Basin. You can't sell it without a permit. And you can't get a permit to do that. But until it leaves your property, you can do with it as you please, as much as you please. Now, your assumption or the opinion that you stated at the beginning there is that groundwater moves. It doesn't move much. And I'll show you, I've got a slide on that that shows the data on that. If you're looking at surface groundwater, the immediate groundwater that's above the aquifers, that's immediately below the surface, what most homeowner wells are going to tap into, that might move a mile in a couple of months. So if I start pumping, for example, if I start pumping out, I'll wait till I get to the slide now. The three agencies that I got here, there are over 100 agencies that have some role in managing water in Texas at the local, state, and federal levels. These are the three that seem to have the most influence. The numbers I put behind them are the number of employees that they have. I couldn't find financial data on these to get an idea of how big they are financially. So I could find out how many employees they had. So I used that as a proxy for size. How big are they? Well, how many people do they employ? Now, it's a little bit misleading because the Texas Water Development Board has legions of volunteers, which wouldn't be included as employees. So they're a little bit more influential than this might indicate because of the volunteers. But if I look at the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that's a major agency in terms of water in the state. And I'll explain a little bit more of that in a second. But essentially, the federal EPA has granted almost all of their responsibilities to TCEQ. So TCEQ displaces the federal EPA in Texas as it relates to most of the water issues. Plus, it has the responsibility given to it by state law. in all of the state actions. And the Clean Water Act and all of the various things that we've done, the Section 303 stuff. The TRA, I put up here as a river authority. There's a San Jacinto River Authority on Lake Conroe. The Trinity River Authority was one of the relatively more recent ones. Surprisingly, it was formed in the 50s. The earliest river authority was the Colorado River that was done in the 30s, and then the Brazos was almost at the same time. These river authorities have a lot of influence in what goes on within the watershed of that particular river. And they are government entities, but they receive no tax money. None, zero. So if you're a taxpayer, you aren't supporting the San Jacinto River Authority at all. They get all their money from fees and permits. And the Texas Water Development Board, the main thing that they do is they serve as a conduit for grants and funding for water projects. I'll show a little bit about that in a slide coming up. But first, we'll do TCEQ. This is the biggie. If you look up here, look for the word permitting, and that gives you an idea of what they're doing that involves money. And of course, involving money is a big player in power issues. But they're responsible for, within the state, making sure that we have clean drinking water. This is huge. They are in charge of water rights. Now, water rights is a topic that's an altogether advanced training topic that talks about how water rights work in Texas. Water rights are a complicated, historical, changing, confusing bunch of issues. The water rights were, some of the water rights in Texas were granted by the King of Spain. Give you an idea as to how things go. And water rights essentially are, if we're in a time of minimal water in Texas, during a time of drought, the water rights establish who can still take water during those times. If we've got ample water, then the water rights become less relevant. Water quality, they do a fair amount of sampling and testing of water around the state. They publish it on a website. It's really kind of interesting because they've got hundreds and hundreds of testing sites, and you can go on the website and take a look at those testing sites and see what the water quality is in that specific spot. This chapter over here did Stream Team, it still does, I believe. The Stream Team people are volunteers that go out and test water quality and report it. We started it, I started it, but I found that there were so many places that the TRA was already testing water around my area that there was no place left for me to do. And they have a sophisticated lab. All I had with the Stream Team were test tubes and titrate droplets. So I decided that using the professional labs as information was a better use of my time. The wastewater and stormwater. Now the permitting of wastewater and stormwater probably is the single biggest source, and I don't know because I haven't seen financials, but I'm guessing that's the single biggest source of money for the river authorities. And this is where they impact most people, is in permitting for septic systems, sewage treatment plants, municipal plants, and the like. And they've done a good job. The water quality in Texas is steadily improved and is still improving. It's pretty impressive what they've been able to accomplish. Groundwater and wells. Notice on the groundwater and wells that you don't see the word permitting. It's missing. They don't have a permitting process for groundwater and wells. And that's because of the different legal issues that are involved. There are planning commissions, and the other speaker will lay that out a whole lot better. The TRA, and actually I think probably every river authority, this is the one I'm familiar with, puts out an annual report. The 2022 wasn't out yet when I put the slides, updated the slides. These are available online, and they're very interesting reading. If you want to learn a little bit more about the watershed that you live in, there's a lot of information in these, and it changes every year. It's not the same old stuff. They have studies, they have data, statistics, they have plans. It's really an impressive document. The Texas Water Development Board puts this out every 5 years. And what they do is they put together a plan, and I should put that in quotation marks because it doesn't meet my definitions very well. But they put together a plan for 50 years to make sure that Texans have enough water resources available to meet their needs. Why am I concerned? The plan, the Texas Water Development Board plan, is actually a roll-up or a compilation of individual plans put together by smaller groups, generally within a single river basin, in some cases 2 or 3 groups within a river basin. And these groups are volunteers aided by experts from the state, but essentially volunteers, politically motivated in some cases, that put together plans for what's going to happen over the next 50 years. And then the state just rolls it all up and combines it into a total document for the state. And then uses that plan to allocate financial resources for the various projects that deal with water resources. When you take a look at the slides that I've got coming up from the 50-year plan, I'll start explaining why I start getting a little nervous about this process as to just how reliable, how good of a process it is. Here's the funding, by the way. So we're looking at $32 billion that's committed. Theoretically over the next 50 years, but most of it's over the next 10 years. If you look at the all of the things up there, W generally means water. C means clean. D means drinking. If you look at the clean water, that's primarily for sewage treatment. So the biggest number up there is for sewage treatment, which is going to be for municipalities. So we've got a lot of sewage treatment plants, municipalities. And as I said, what we've done in terms of water quality has been good. The water quality has been steadily improving. And that's where we're putting our money. No big surprise, no big shock there. Here is the 50-year plan, the current one. Actually, this is the 2022 plan, which technically is in draft form. It shows that the need for municipal water almost doubles in 50 years. And it seems to show that the need for agricultural water goes down 20% over the next 50 years. And if you take a look at the other uses, mining, manufacturing, steam, which is cooling water, livestock, all of those are pale in comparison to the big users of agriculture and residential for cities. So I look at that. Okay, number one, the growth in the residential need is based upon extrapolating past historical population trends forward. Now, I'm not sure that extrapolating the past is the cleverest way to predict future population. I think that there are cultural forces, geographical forces, political forces that will potentially affect that. In saying that we've been growing exponentially for the last 50 years, therefore we'll continue to grow exponentially for the next 50 years, ignores all of the forces that are relating to population. So I'm not sure that we were starting off with a good basic assumption, that is population growth. Yes, sir.
So do you think that curve needs to be, the slope needs to be increased or decreased based on those comments?
I think it'll be decreased, but that's, I call that a belly button. Everybody has one, an opinion.
But we value your opinion.
Oh, well, I look at it and think, if you increase things exponentially forever, they go to infinity. And I can't imagine that we're going to have an infinite population.
I have a quick question on the difference between municipal and irrigation. In this assumption, it's that the people or homes, people living are going to increase, which would mean there'd be possibly more housing. So I'm confused on how irrigation would be decreasing,
Irrigation, think farming.
but then livestock.
The vast majority, in fact, is the irrigation by definition on here is for agriculture. Irrigating your yard doesn't count. That's not agriculture. Even if you think it is. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think the pandemic has had an effect on decentralization of the municipalities?
I don't understand the question.
I think there's a lot of commercial real estate in Houston that's empty because of people opting to stay at home. And so does that mean that that's, or move to the country, does that mean that things are going to change in that?
Well, certainly it has a temporary impact, that's for sure.
You think
The pandemic, people, the way they work and how they work has changed. And it's probably changed permanently,
I think so.
but maybe not as profound as what we saw during the pandemic itself. But once again, that becomes a belly button for me.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I don't really understand, like, if populations are growing and municipality need is increasing, how come the need to grow more food isn't increasing, therefore increasing irrigation water?
You are a man after my heart. I look at these things and it raises questions and I go, wait a minute, this doesn't logically follow, does it?
Even with synthetic foods, you still have to water the crops, so.
Synthetic foods.
I'm sort of looking at this and seeing that farmland is being eaten up by municipalities.
That's not the issue.
No?
No.
Okay.
That is true, but its impact is relatively small.
Okay, thank you.
If I can drill down a little bit, here's a test, and unfortunately the top of it is cut off here, so I'll read it for you. Which of these regions, according to the 50-year plan, has the greatest shortfall over the next 50 years? According to the plan, which region has the greatest shortfall? Somebody thinks H, Houston. H for Houston.
I'm thinking C.
C for Dallas. Where's L?
South Central Texas.
Oh, L and K, I gotcha. There's lots of growth there. Yeah, you're all thinking residential. You're all thinking population. The greatest shortfall, if you look at this chart, is actually going to be O.
Which one is that?
West Texas.
I can't see it.
Lano, the up in the No, what, I got, yeah, Lubbock would be, that would be the area of Lubbock. So what's going on? What is going on? If I take a look at the demand in the water plan for O, I've got this huge demand, but the 50-year plans only produce that much water. So if I take a look at how the money is being spent over the next 50 years, it's not being spent on agriculture. It's being spent on waste treatment plants and water purification plants. It's being spent by the cities. So the number of voters in the residential areas outnumber the number of farmers in the farming areas. So when you take a look at plans put together by the people, you're going to end up with this situation, not surprisingly. But there are other issues. Coming up with water for agriculture is a more daunting task than coming up with water for residential, as we'll talk about in a second here.
Just briefly, where is M? Also the same issues?
Rio Grande.
Okay, thank you.
Now, there are some. I always tell people that if you take a complex problem and come up with a simple answer, you've got to be wrong. And in this case, I'm presenting a simple answer, so it's not going to hold up to everything. The Rio Grande is a different kind of complexity. You've got an international river, so planning for water is a little bit more complicated because of the international issues that you're dealing with. You're dealing with multi-states. You're dealing with generally a less affluent population. So there are a lot of factors that come into this, and my overall simplification doesn't hold up to absolutely everything. Or you may have just more realistic people done. Yes.
Kind of a two-part question. Does runoff versus runoff versus ground absorption, does that affect water capture? Like if something runs off, will it avoid being captured versus absorbing into the ground?
Correct.
So with a lot of agricultural resources using fertilizers, which are mostly salt, would that increase the runoff chance, therefore removing the absorption rate?
Yeah, I've got a slide that shows some data on that actually. What's the other thing to draw from here is if you take a look at C and H, you'll note that the demand, which is based upon a doubling of population, that there are projects in place and funding in place to meet those demands. So the cities are being taken care of, but maybe the population won't grow as much because there's going to be starvation. So the concept of gosh, can we have unfettered residential growth without having some balancing growth in agriculture? Yes, sir.
Do any of those plans include a bit of desalinization plan, like Campbell?
Actually, there are some, and it's via the reverse osmosis process that I was talking about, mainly in West Texas, by the way.
Oh, wow.
And part of that reason is if you go down into the aquifers, you get to a certain point and it becomes salt water. So there's water down there, it's just that it's salty. So you have to,
Midland?
what's that?
Have you ever lived in Midland?
I wouldn't want to.
They got some nasty water.
Yes, ma'am.
Do some of these plans also include like flood mitigation and preparation?
This part does not. There are plans for flood mitigation. In fact, there's a meeting coming up on that for at least for the Trinity River.
Right, yeah, I was just curious if these funds also included
Now, these funds are for water resources.
resources.
Yeah.
And those two won't meet?
Say again?
Those two won't meet, alter?
They seem to overlap.
They have different goals and objectives.
Okay.
The flood people seem to think that If you straighten and deepen channels and make the water move faster, you'll have less flooding. Which another belly button is that's BS.
Yes.
That the best thing to do is to slow the water down and let it be absorbed. And for flood control. Yes, ma'am.
Does it include any plans for like reclamation as far as like rainwater, like
Yes.
recycling rainwater?
Yes. Yes.
Do any of these statistics have anything to do with reservoir management?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, one last one, wastewater management, does it include that?
Yes.
Yes.
Is much of that demand for leaching old area accepted by oil and gas?
No,
Okay.
that's agriculture. That's, you're looking at cotton fields. Lots of them. Here it is. Basically another slice, summary slice. And as you can see, for the next 50 years, we're planning on meeting this municipal needs for drinking water. As long as they don't have to wash their food. But irrigation, it's pathetic. We don't have plans to deal with agriculture at all for the next 50 years. We better get our food from California.
Oh, good luck.
Yes, ma'am.
Some of the water needs, have they gotten, I mean, I assume you've been watching this, has it changed to better water, like, I'm trying to say, like, better irrigation practices? Like,
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, the agricultural demand in terms, or the productivity of agriculture has been going up and has been going up for a long time. So it's, that counters the everybody's going to starve argument because we're becoming more productive and using the land better. And there are irrigation techniques that are far better than the big sprayers. The drip.
Yeah, you guys.
Yeah, and there are other agricultural practices too. If you want to study that, the NCRS, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, does a lot of work in this area and increasing the productivity of agriculture. They're a good agency, and they're a source of funds. Surface water, I mentioned earlier that the surface waters all flow into the Gulf of Mexico. Some of them go through other states before they get there, but eventually we don't have northern flowing rivers. And if you look at geology again, the Rocky Mountains have been trying to work their way into the Gulf of Mexico via erosion for a long time. And what we have is basically these rivers are carrying silt and from the Rocky Mountains to form clay, which forms much of the Gulf Coast area. If you go up to where I was born in Wisconsin, you go down 3 feet, 4 feet, you find limestone. Here, you go down 3 or 4 feet, you find clay. You go down 40 feet, you find clay. You go down 400 feet, you find clay. So basically, it's been building up over a long, long time via this process of the Rocky Mountains working their way to the sea little by little. I don't have this as a test, but everybody likes to ask this question when they're talking about water in Texas. How many natural lakes do we have in Texas?
One.
Actually, one is correct, sort of. And I say sort of. If you take a look at Cattle Lake, it was actually formed originally by a log jam. So it was a dammed up river. It's just that it wasn't done by man. So it wasn't a man-made lake. So technically I should have asked the question, how many lakes in Texas are not man-made? Now, if I take a look at how many major reservoirs in Texas, how many major reservoirs in Texas were built for flood control?
7.
The answer is all of them except one. the Corps of Engineers has built most of the reservoirs in Texas primarily for flood control. And we can argue, I mean, certainly if you look at Conroe and Kingwood, you know, the arguments via the issues on flood control and how good a job it's being done. The exception is Lake Livingston. Lake Livingston was paid for 100% by the city of Houston, using contractors out of Dallas. A little over $70 million in 1969 to build a lake to provide for the future water needs of Houston. And the reason that they did that at that time is they were losing entire subdivisions to subsidence. They were pumping so much groundwater out that the ground was sinking. In some cases, it sunk as much as 16 feet. And what happened is the Gulf of Mexico came in and reclaimed that development because it was now below sea level.
Where was that?
On, was it Channelview maybe?
Brownwood and Baytown.
Baytown, yeah, somewhere down in there. It's a,
I grew up in Baytown. It was up to me.
if I take a look at rainfall, and keep in mind, when you're looking at these little graphs, that a lot of this is the short cycle rain, short water cycle. But the rain, if you could go all the way to Orange, Texas, it's over 60 inches a year. And if you get to El Paso, it's less than 10. So what this means for us, I always look at first thing I look at when I'm looking at an issue is how does it affect me? Since I live here in East Texas, I'm looking at a lot of rain, I'm looking at a lot of water. So the issue that I have is if I've got 60 inches of rain and each inch gives me 13,000 gallons per half acre, 26,000 gallons per acre, how am I going to make use of that water and how am I going to put it to good stead? This shows the river basins. I know we're in the San Jacinto River Basin, but that's a little tiny short one that doesn't really have much influence on anything other than Houston and Montgomery County. You look at the Trinity River Basin, and what's interesting there, and something that I want you to remember for a later slide, is much of the Trinity River Basin, the lower Trinity River Basin, is in this high rainfall area. It's also heavily wooded area. So you would expect that there would be some impact on the lower Trinity River that's caused by the amount of rainfall and the land use. Here's Lake Livingston. We have, if you measure wealth by how much water you have, we're wealthy people in East Texas. Bet you never heard anybody say that. The dam was completed in 1969. It took 2 years to reach what they call pool level. Pool level for Lake Livingston is 131 feet above sea level. That's the level that they try to maintain the lake at. They have easements as a property owner along the lake. I know about those easements, that they can raise the water level in the lake up to 135 feet legally. And they have an easement that allows them to do that. At 131 feet, it's 83,000 acres, second largest lake in Texas, wholly in Texas, because you only count half of the legal band. At 135 feet, we're looking at over 100,000 acres. You know, it grows quite a bit as it expands up over the shores, over the banks. Fortunately, my house is 160 feet above sea level. Interesting tidbit for me is I have a well. My well goes down 160 feet, but the water level in the well that you're pumping out of is 30 feet down. Oh, wait a minute. The lake's at 131 feet And I'm at 160 feet, and 30 feet below that is where my water level is. Oh gosh, the water level is exactly the same level as the lake. Oh gosh, does that mean that the water from the lake is running into my well? Am I drinking lake water? And the answer is, well, of course. But so is most of the city of Houston. Lake Livingston provides between 60 and 90% of the water for the city of Houston. Conroe and Lake Houston provide primarily the difference. And as you all know, they're looking at using Conroe for Montgomery County. And City of Houston giving up or selling its rights, I'm not sure which it is, to Montgomery County for the water rights there, which theoretically means that Houston's going to draw that much more water from Livingston. You may know that a couple of 3 years ago, one of the ways that we redistributed water in Texas is move water from one river basin to another, is the Luce Bayou was built. The Luce Bayou moves water from the Trinity River to the San Jacinto River, just above Lake Houston. So that will allow basically Lake Livingston to pick up the slack. And if you look at the 50-year history of the lake, it's very rare that it's not full. There are some times, if you look at around 2006, for those of you that are around that time, you may know that Hurricane Rita just about tore the dam out, tore all the riprap off the face of the dam, and all we had left was a pile of clay holding back the river. The people down in Dayton started to shiver a little bit. They moved the level of the lake down so that they could rebuild the dam. And it took them 2 years to do that. So that's why we have the drop in 2006. But even then, it was only down about 15–20%. It still had most of its capacity. If you look at the life of a reservoir, the life of a reservoir is generally estimated to be 100 years in Texas. This reservoir is 50 years old. Now, how do you know that the reservoir is at the end of its life? The answer is when the silt builds up enough so that it's at the bottom of the gates of the dam. That's the definition. Now, they just did a survey 3 years ago now on Lake Livingston, and the silt buildup is in the neighborhood of 10–12%. So if you look at a 100-year life and we're halfway through, the data would tend to show otherwise, that there are some other factors going on here. The 2011 drought is here, and as you know, in parts of the state, the reservoirs dried up completely in 2011. That was a major drought event, but it didn't affect us all that much. I mean, it went down, but gosh, 10%, not 100%, nowhere near that. So we are blessed with water. Yes, ma'am.
Can you dredge the silt back out of the reservoir?
Yes, you can. How much money do you get? I actually did that on a reservoir up in Wichita Falls. And this reservoir was 150 acres or something like that. A little bit smaller than our 85,000 acre. And it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 million to dredge it. So if I take 85,000, divided by 150, multiplied by 70 million, the Texas Water Development Board had better get busy. Yes, ma'am.
So in this, whenever this is done, what happens to the reservoir, at the end of its life? Does it just, what happens?
Comes wetlands.
How is it?
Those are good for water quality. There's some interesting issues on reservoirs. I've got a slide that shows one of the interesting issues, I think. But first, I'll reinforce the value of the Trinity River for water in Texas. The Trinity River is the largest source of water for the people of Texas. Substantial. going down to the San Jacinto is 30,000. I think these are acre feet per year. 30,000 versus 2.8 million for the Trinity. So using water from the Trinity for the development in this part of Texas is the logical direction that we would go, and it is the direction that we're going. If I take a look at water quality, now water is only good if I can use it. And if I take a look at water quality, how many people realize that the Trinity River is bisected by huge strip mining coal mines? The picture up there of a coal strip mine up around Highway 7, up in the Buffalo area. You got huge strip mines up there. And strip mines potentially can affect the water in the river in many ways, including heavy metals, but also siltation and runoff. The coal mines supposedly are doing a pretty good job, and the data would indicate that they are doing a pretty good job at mitigating that. I worry though is as coal becomes less viable, whether that money will still be available for mitigation and management. So that does cause me some concern living downstream from the coal mines. Agriculture. I'll show another slide in a second on agriculture. We do have some agriculture upstream. Agriculture affects us in several ways. Number one is it will increase runoff versus infiltration. It does tend to add siltation, and it does tend to add phosphates and pesticides. I will say though that the farmers in Texas are doing I think, a terrific job at managing those issues. And once again, the NCRS provides grants to the farmers and advice and counseling. And of course, AgriLife participates in this as well.
What does NCRS stand for?
Gosh, I don't know.
National something?
I don't know. It's part of the university, part of the Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
Soil conservation, National Soil Conservation.
Oh.
Our what's the word? I don't know. National Conservation, something soil.
I'll look it up.
Yes, sir.
Those runoffs from the pesticides and fertilizers, does that increase the pH of the water? And then wouldn't that in turn increase the evaporation?
Well, pH is going to come from alkaline, and fertilizer tends to be alkaline, so I guess it would. The pH is not bad. If you look at the pH of the lake, you know, what does the pH affect in a lake? Why would we worry about it?
So, because critters need between 6 and 9 to survive.
Exactly. Well, it's not only that, their ability to reproduce is affected first. So the ability of fish to reproduce is affected by the pH of the water. So if you like fish, pH is something to look at, that and dissolved oxygen.
Natural Resources Conservation Service.
Thank you.
Silviculture. Once again, the silviculture people are doing a pretty good job. They leave bands of trees along waterways so as to prevent the siltation, which would be the primary impact of silviculture. Wait, that's not true. The primary impact of silviculture is trees are great, absolutely fantastic for the water cycle and for infiltration both, and for holding down the soil. So trees are a really good thing. So the impact of silviculture is removing trees is the biggest impact. If you're a tree hugger, the more trees, the better. I'm a tree hugger. And lastly, cities. Ugly, ugly, ugly. Nothing good to say about cities. Cities are awful. We could do without cities. We need to get rid of cities. Cities are troublesome on river basins. And we have DFW on our river basin. You all have Houston, although it's downstream of it. So the cities have all kinds of negative impacts, both in quantity of water, flood control, water quality, the whole deal. Interesting tidbit. Interesting for me, at least, maybe. The average coliform count in Lake Livingston is under 10 parts per million in the main part of the lake. The average coliform count in the creeks and bayous of Houston is over 1,400 parts per million. So we're looking at something that's 140 times greater. You all know what coliform is?
Bacteria.
Fecal bacteria from mammals. When they look at the DNA of the coliform in the streams and bayous in Texas, what do you think it points to? Dogs. Dogs, exactly right, dogs. So people are allowing their dogs to pollute the water to unswimmable, unusable levels in the city of Houston. Fortunately, I don't have a dog, so you call rest easy for your drinking water. If I take a look at the Trinity River Basin, and I've got this by the way is something that's easily available at the TCEQ website. TCEQ used to print this terrific book, coffee table book, and give it away. It has all of the river basins in Texas and the rivers and streams and the lakes. And they quit doing it and they now publish it on the internet only. I don't think you can get this anymore unless you can find somebody that has a stash put away. If I look at it, on the whole river basin, keeping in mind that a lot of the rainfall is in the lower half of this river basin. So a lot of the water that we're talking about is coming in the lower half and is not impacted by what's going on in Dallas, what's going on northwest of Fort Worth in the ranches. And the yellow area is agriculture. You can see that there's relatively little agriculture in the high rainfall areas. And a lot of the trees in the high rainfall areas. So that contributes, once again, as a positive thing for the city of Houston and their future water in terms of the water quality. Let's take a look at another river basin. I'm looking at this one. This one has it looks pretty small down there by the sign that says Jasper. That's actually a Dam B or Lake Steinhagen. And you go above that, you got the Angelina River, that's the Sam Rayburn, which by the way is the largest reservoir. And then you've got the Sabine River, I'm sorry, not the Sabine, the Neches River, which is coming down through the agricultural area. So I wonder, if I take a look at land use, this is conversion. These are conversion numbers. It may be hard for you to see, but if I look over in the Angelina River, I'm looking at 24% of the land has been converted by man to something other than what it was before. So man has converted 24% of the land to something other than what its natural state. If I look at the white area to the west, where the Neches River, I see just the opposite. 75% has been converted primarily to agriculture from its natural habitat. And in between, it's in between. Now, can I see the impact of that? Here's a Google Earth of the confluence of those two rivers coming from different areas, a Google Earth view. And it's pretty impressive. the difference in how the water looks coming from the agricultural area versus how it's coming from the wooded areas, from the tree areas. Trees are good. I've said that before. If I take a look at Lake Livingston, also with Google Earth, see something that I find interesting. And that is, there is a causeway in Alaska that goes across, and there's a relatively narrow opening for a bridge on the west side that has to be tall enough for boats to come navigate through. Although you wonder how in the world the boats get around the dam to get there. You know, regulations are regulations, right? Here's another tidbit for you. The first dam on the Trinity River, the first dam and only dam is Lake Livingston, is Livingston Dam. The river does not have a dam above it, above Lake Livingston. What I see here is that causeway looks like some sort of copper dam to the water quality units. It slows down the water above the causeway and causes the siltation to more to stay up there, and you get less flowing into the lower half of the lake. And that was shown in the studies too, when I said that the average amount of the lake siltation is much higher north of that causeway than it is south of the causeway. The big part, the deep part of the lake is not silting very fast at all, and I think a lot of that is because of that causeway, because we have a dam. Now, there are other ways to reduce siltation. The question came up, dredging it. The best way is to divert the water above the lake and run it through a wetlands area. And that tends to clean the water up in significant degrees. You say, well, that's what we need to do. The problem is when you divert 100 gallons, you get 30 gallons back. The rest of it you lose to evaporation and transpiration. That's why that earlier slide is so important. If I take a look, I'm not going to go into this because we really don't have enough time, but you can go on to the TCQ sub site and you can look at data. I'm not going to go into it. And you can look at the various sampling sites and take a look at all kinds of chemicals that I've never heard of that they've been measuring and monitoring. You can take a look at turbidity and dissolved solids and suspended solids and pH throughout various places. So if you have an interest of one piece of water somewhere that you like, that you fish at, that you live by, that you take hikes by, this is a good place to go and take a look at what's going on in that water, because chances are they have a testing site around that. And if not that, then look at the stream team, because they may be testing it. I'm gonna go ahead and do this video. This is getting a little old. It's put out by the Texas Water Development Board. But it's kind of interesting as an overview to groundwater. And I'm going to go more fast through groundwater because it's going to be covered by the next speaker. Skip it. It's an old video, right? You guys will go to sleep if I give you videos. These are the aquifers that are referred to. These are the major aquifers. And one of the obvious questions are, they're hurting for water down here. We got lots of water up here. Doesn't it just flow down through the aquifer and transport water naturally from one end to the other? And the answer is yes, very, very slowly. It does move. On the other hand, I think I'm going to reboot now. On the other hand, if you go to the blue area there, which is the Edwards Aquifer, it's made up of karst, and it's relatively porous. The Gulf Coast aquifer is clay, and it doesn't transport water very rapidly, where the Edwards has a semi-porous limestone, which transfers more rapidly. So it does tend to move in that area at a much more rapid pace. It also recharges faster. If I take a look at that in a diagram illustration, this is an illustration of the Edwards Aquifer, and it's not really a good diagram, but it does have all the terms, and it looks like it's got underground rivers and streams, and that the water is moving all the time. If you look at the karst, what they call the limestone, Edwards limestone and associated limestone, that's what it looks like. Those are little holes. Now, there are some big holes, there are some underground rivers, but for the most part, you're looking at something that's like a sponge, and it doesn't go through it as fast as a river, although it does flow. If I take a look in general at groundwater, the problem with groundwater is if you take a look at a well like I have, a pumped well, and I'm pumping out of the unconfined aquifer, this is the groundwater that's above the first confining bed, the level of clay that doesn't allow the water to go through it very quickly. And it's a matter of days or years for groundwater to flow from one part to another. So my well is continually being replenished. When I pump the groundwater out there, it flows in from other parts around, not immediately. If I pump all the way down to the bottom, it takes a couple of hours to build back up. If I were to continue to do that, I might have days without water. Now, in my case, since it appears that it's coming from Lake Livingston, which is about 200 feet away, it comes back pretty quickly. And fortunately, it goes through enough clay that it's filtered and that the water quality is really very good, except for hardness. Boy, is it hard. We're looking at 22 to 25 grains of hardness in the water that comes up out of my well. So in my house, what I do is I filter it, treat it, run it through a softener, and then run it through an RO filter to take care of the issues with the hardness. Fortunately, I do not have problems with pesticides or fertilizers or sulfates or any of the other things that might affect the drinking water. If I look at confined water, which is really what the aquifers are talking about the prior diagram, when I talked about aquifers, those are confined. They're confined by either some form of rock or more likely in Texas clay. It may take centuries for waters to move across the aquifer. So for water to go from Houston down to Brownsville, we might be looking at centuries or even millennia, depending upon which part of the aquifer we're talking about. Not very speedy in any case. If I look at groundwater use by county, look at where the agriculture is. And you see the heavy use of groundwater. And the problem, there's several problems with that. The other blue areas, for example, if you look in East Texas, you say, wait a minute, they get lots of rain. Why are they pumping out their groundwater? And the answer is they don't have municipal water sources. They don't have the infrastructure in place to capture the surface water. So they're using wells just like I do. If I take a look at this particular aquifer, the Ogallala, this is really interesting. Won't delve into the politics of it, but if you take a look at this aquifer, it does span 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states. And y'all can imagine, these states work together to manage that aquifer for the benefit of all of mankind, right? These states have consistent laws with regard to land water or groundwater use and pumping, correct? None of the above. That's another choice, by the way. None of the above. There's not a coordinated effort to say this. So what it amounts to is I'm going to pump the water out before somebody else does. So that puts a competition to get to the water as quickly as possible before it disappears. And they keep drilling wells deeper and deeper and deeper to get to that water. And there's not a good mechanism in place to manage this for future generations. And it's political in nature, of course, but also it's a complex problem. If it takes a long time for the water to regenerate in these areas, what are you going to do? I mean, how do I do it? The only thing that I can look at is I've got to make agriculture more productive. And, you know, mainly I believe that's what's being done. Or you can divert surface water. You can move surface water from where it's bountiful, say East Texas, and move it to West Texas. You do that via canals, such as the Luz Bayou, which is a relatively small jump, but there's some up in Dallas area too. Or you can do it with pipes. We can start piping water from where it is to where it's needed. So there are potential solutions. It's a matter of spending the money. And our state apparently doesn't think it's going to spend the money on agriculture, according to its own plan. And what I see is the groundwater aquifers over the next 50 years just steadily go down to the point where agriculture becomes not viable. This slide I'll do just briefly and to point out that the aquifer is not a pool that's down there somewhere that you can tap into with a straw. They tend to be at angles, and there tends to be a fair amount of saltwater intrusion into the aquifers. If you go deep enough, it gets salty. And if you pump water out, two things happen. One is the land sinks, and two, it becomes saltier. It becomes less usable. Here's the diagram of the subsidence in Houston, where it went down over the years, which caused Houston to decide that they're going to rely on surface water rather than groundwater, because they were going to disappear into the Gulf of Mexico over time if they continued doing what they were doing, or the water had just become too salty to be practical. Need for water in the future, what can we do? We can do new reservoirs. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Certainly that's an expensive solution. And as I said, I'll come back to that. We can replenish aquifers. That's what they're doing in the Edwards Aquifer. That's what they're doing in the Hill Country. That's what they're doing in Central Texas. They're trying to develop techniques that allow for greater absorption of water and less runoff. Part of that is native grasses that have 20 and 30-foot roots that allow a pathway for the water down into the water table. Part of it is the way they capture the water and what they do with it when they capture it. Conservation. Certainly we do that in California now. You can only water your silly grass lawn once a week. You can do conservation to reduce the demand, especially in the residential areas, but you can also do it in agriculture via good farming technique. Technology, right now that's desalinization. In the future, it could be natural gas, getting water from natural gas, I don't know. But right now the technology would point towards desalinization. And by the way, there are countries that have massive desalinization, such as Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia also has massive energy supplies. So they can trade energy for water. They don't have water, they do have energy, so they can make a trade. And they do that via desalinization. Regional reroute, which we've talked about, canals and pipelines. And this is really a form of conservation, the recovery and reuse of water. The reason I say that as a separate item is that's a gray water solution where you take the gray water and use it for irrigation or for pumps or for lawns. So if I take a look at reservoirs, we have 187 major reservoirs in Texas. There's been one built in the last 30 years. So of the 187 reservoirs, one's been built in the last 30 years. And that's very recent. It's 2021, first major reservoir, 16,000 acres. So what is that, 1/5 the size of Lake Livingston? And that opened up northeast of Dallas. If I take a look at reservoirs and planting, there are 23 that are in the Texas Water Development Board plan for reservoirs. Gosh. They're going to be built in 10 years. Now, if you take a look at this graph, where it says 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, the graph looks exactly the same 10 years ago, except for the numbers at the bottom have changed. 20 years ago, looks exactly the same, except the numbers at the bottom changed. All they do is they slide the numbers 10 years out each time. They're going to build all these reservoirs in the next 10 years. And they keep saying that every 10 years. Amateurs and politicians, we're dealing with promises. Not sure that that's good, reliable data. I don't think reservoirs is the solution. Here's something else that's interesting to me. I looked at the Trinity River in Crockett and the Trinity River in Goodrich. For those of you that know the geography, Crockett's above Lake Livingston, Goodrich is below Lake Livingston. And if I look at the Trinity River, it more or less, its flows more or less are the same size as Goodrich. So if I were to pick up the Trinity River and put it in a aqueduct and run it over Lake Livingston and dump it back down in Lake Goodrich, that's what I would see. It's unchanged by what happens between Crockett and Goodrich. Unchanged in flows. Oh, wait a minute. We've got lots of creeks, lots of rainfall flowing into the lake. What happens to all that water? No. Actually, there may be a misconception, as one that I had at the beginning, and that is that Houston's pumping water out of the lake. It's not. Houston actually pumps the water out in Dayton. So it goes down the river past Goodrich into Dayton, and that's where the big pumps are that take the water for Houston. So that's all downstream. The water's evaporated. Has to be. That's the only explanation. Only possible explanation is all of the water that flows in from all of these creeks around the lake is just being evaporated away. So, as an efficient way to store water, you wonder whether reservoirs are the solution, whether they're a good idea. I think I'm at the end. Yes, I am. So, Lisa.
We've got, at about 10:20, we're gonna take a break. So we got 10 minutes for questions or one of these.
For those of you that have interest in this topic, the Master Naturalist has a path for you to follow. Texas Waters, Johnny Smith, and it's a specific series of seminars, classes. They're held online now. And you take the classes and you volunteer on water resource projects. For example, you can come over and help on our project. That's something you do. When I say our project, I mean our jointly, because we kind of work together on this now. This is a path that you can go. In any case, this book, your chapter should have this available.
There's some people in here doing the water certification, right?
Yeah.
This is a really, really good book.
Where do you find the resources and the classes you're talking about? Where do I find those?
They appear in our bulletin, and Melissa can change your VMS to show that you're trying to do the water certification.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, you said there were classes, webinars?
Yeah, I think you probably get there. I think you get there by going to Texas Waters.
Yeah,
It's
there's
Texas
once a
Waters.
month class.
TexasWaters.org, maybe. Certainly you could get there through the Master Naturalist website. I'm sure there are links that lead you there eventually.
They were the same ones that we had on their, oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
I thought they were other.
They're good, yeah.
Same one.
I think they're great classes, much better than what you guys are getting today. Yes, sir.
How do we join the water conservation?
Terry MacArthur's coming and doing the talk for
Yeah.
Texas.
There's a lot. So also today from 1:30 to 4:30, there's a water lab that Terry's doing at Fairbridge, Rec Center.
Basically what you do is start taking the classes and putting them in the, marking them into the
VMS.
VMS system. Yes, sir.
So if I just kind of summarize what I saw, you do not have a very optimistic view of water resources available in the state of Texas, and I think that's probably for the rest of the country. What's going to change it? What's going to change the current trajectory?
I think that the availability of water will constrain population growth, for one thing. Now, I don't know exactly the mechanism that that's going to happen, but I think that it'll have some impact. The answer is, one answer is technology. There's plenty of water. There's no shortage of water. It's just salty or polluted or in the wrong place. All of those things can be solved by technology. Yes, sir.
So okay, anything's solvable with enough money, but that tells you that you're going to pay a lot more for food and or textiles and cotton or actually crop. You agree?
Yes.
How much as a percentage increase in the next 20, 30, 50 years, what do you think food prices go up just based on water availability?
Even my belly button doesn't have an answer to that. I don't have a clue. Yes, ma'am.
I've always thought of, I don't know if I'm correct or not, but thought of cotton as a really thirsty crop, and I'm wondering, how do they look like, is that really the best use of that agricultural land, your opinion?
Well, these are 100% cotton. This is 100% cotton.
Is that the best place to raise cotton, and is that the best use of that water, is flows? And am I correct, is cotton a thirsty crop?
Do you believe in free markets and capitalism? Because if you do, that's the answer to the question. If you don't, if you believe the government should determine how the land is used.
Well, it kind of sounds like the water's so cheap that we can use it that way.
That is a good philosophical question about everybody thinking that water is free. It ain't.
Yeah.
If you get over the idea that water is free and limitless, then you can start working on solutions.
Thank you. What about education?
Education's a good thing. I think people coming on a Saturday morning to take a class is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
I'm talking about lawn watering, education of what kind of resource that takes.
We do education, and it's in the form of converting lawns to native plants. And there are organizations that are espousing that, and there are advocates of that, and it's becoming more and more popular. I think it's a good trend and a good direction. St. Augustine is not so good. You again.
I'll just say, I'm converting my yard, it is not easy.
No,
It
it's
is
not.
not easy.
No, I've never used herbicides or pesticides on my yard, so sometimes it does convert itself.
And educating HOAs is really important too.
I have no HOA. I live in the country.
Yeah, I know.
End of the free. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I know Jeff's changing his yard, and I know that like most of us are probably in a situation where you can own a home or rent affordably. But do you have any suggestions for disproportionate folks or underrepresented communities who don't have the money to change their entire yard or have the access to those things? Like, do you have any like low cost alternatives?
What I would do is I would join one of the Native Plant Society groups and
Is
work
there
with
a
them.
fee with that?
Hmm?
There's a fee. Like, I'm looking for something though that like,
It's insignificant. It's,
but are there like, are you required to do stuff?
gosh, I don't know.
And the Native Plant Society is totally private. And so it's not like the master gardeners or the master naturalists where you have to put in so many hours and all that stuff. You can go or not, you know, as you see fit. It's $25 a year. There are also other, like I'm also a member of the Herb Society.
Yeah.
And there's a really nice chapter, and there's like 2 chapters, I think, in Houston, and I'm in the one in Huntsville. And that's a lot of plant-minded people. And these are all like plant organizations, you know, and so then you trade seeds, you trade plants, you.
No, I understand. I know, like, I'm just wondering if there's anything available for non-native English speakers, communities that aren't usually represented. Because like people that I know that are low income Spanish speaking populations don't usually know about these. And so I'm just trying to think like, how can I better communicate?
Okay, now,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you do anything, like no pressure. I was just like looking at the DEI and AS stuff.
one of the wonderful things about native plants that I found is that I can find a native plant in a friend's yard and propagate it in my yard. So the cost to it is whatever it costs for me to wash my clothes after they get all sweaty.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking too is that all of these plant organizations that are essentially free, everybody trades plants and gives away plants. And you want to start something, then the critical part is just asking our attention. Whether or not they're all going to be bilingual, that I can't tell you.
I'm sure they're not, I'll be honest.
I have some Turk's cap that's sourced from the Huntsville Native Plant Society.
Which is edible. I just read that in my
It is.
energy co-op
Yeah.
monthly magazine.
Yep, I know.
You know, and planting edibles, they teach that in elementary schools in Houston, you know, where they set up
Yeah.
growing jalapenos, for example, or whatever, just in a little container.
Actually.
Did you know that green briar is edible? I wish you would come and eat every bit of it. And it, by the way, is easy to propagate.
And chickweed.
Lisa, it's 20 after.
Okay, any more questions? You don't have anything? Okay. That was that royal week.
Native grasses, not my expertise.
I don't have expertise on native grasses. but we'll look at
Okay, we don't have the answer to that one.
it. We can take out lawn and put in pollinator garden. Yeah. Which one, prairie grass or lawn grass? What are y'all converting your yards to? I'm putting in native. And,
I'm putting in primarily
yeah,
bushes.
inland sea oats are good down here, and they kind of want some shade.
I'm putting in rose mallow, Turk's Cap, buttonbush, river birch are the primary things I'm putting in.
Salvias.
Some of those though are just good by water, right? Like,
I
but,
live by water, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Buttonbush want more, yeah. And that's one thing about native plants, I give presentations on native plants, is that, we'll hear so much about you don't have to water them. Well, it depends on the plant. And so, like, some take a lot of water, like buttonbush or swamp sunflower, the reason it's called swamp sunflower. So some want a lot of water and some don't. And so plant accordingly. Some want a lot of sun, plant sun, some don't, so plant accordingly.
She's putting some up there.
American beautyberry, Turk's Cap, Monarda. Monarda is also called bee balm. Mexican hat wants a lot more sun. Turk's Cap, American beautyberry wants some shade. It tends to be an understory thing. You'll find it a lot in the piney woods.
I've got some dogwood planted for an understory tree. And I've got some beautyberries lined up that are gonna be planted. I'm gonna wait for a better time to plant.
I just got, well, it y'all's thing. I got a kind of, oh shoot, dogwood that's a bush instead of a tree, and the deer just ate the whole top off of it. Right?
My dogwood has a wire cage around it.
Well, now mine will. So anyway, we're gonna take a 10-minute break. Thank you, Ron.
And then I do have
What did you plan to do?
share.
We're going to Canada.
Yes.
Okay, so on the, we got the. I want to announce that, and I'm just gonna say, as I.
Hey, someone online, can y'all see anything on Zoom? I wanted you to do something. Anyone online?
Nothing's sharing yet. It's black.
Okay, because what we're seeing over here is it says we are sharing. So it's really weird.
I do. I told my husband. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see it now.
I think we stopped sharing.
If there's no rain, then I kind of work on that. Most of the time, like, when we actually get rain.
Oh, yeah, I'm having it. What's happening is I'm having
And it's under
Hold on. They put the slide stretched out. Are you staying on the whole screen or do you see a lot of black? That's the whole. That's usually the big one. Yeah. More. Right.
Okay, we'll do.
She normally answers pretty good.
Okay.
Watch the master version.
PDF anywhere? Which one do you get the? Oh, here. Yeah, but this one, he's trying to get it in. Not really. Right, hold on. So now what do you say? Right. Okay, what do you see now, Brad? Yeah, that's
Let me make a couple of notes. Okay. Sorry, we had a little technical difficulties to get through, but I have a couple of announcements. Or, you know what, I can make those at the end. Let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Gaynor. This is Dr. Neil Gaynor. He's a member of the San Jacinto Regional Flood Planning Group representing the Upper Watershed, a recently re-elected director of Montgomery County Municipal Utility District Number 6, a trustee of the Woodlands Water Agency, and a board member of the Grogan's Mill Village Association. He is a retired geologist with a Bachelor's of Science degree in geology from the University of Melbourne and a PhD in geosciences from UT Dallas. He has nearly 40 years of experience in oil and gas research, exploration, and development in the U.S. and internationally. Neil's community activities include the Woodlands Green, teaching pre-COVID at the Academy for Lifelong Learning at Montgomery College, and assisting development of a watershed protection plan with the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership. He has interest in equitable water resource management, optimization of conjunctive use, and flood mitigation. Woo-hoo. Okay, so. Thank you.
Maybe you should hold, whoop, hang on. Am I on?
It was on.
It was on, I'm sorry. Maybe you should hold your applause until we get through this. Next, I'll try to abbreviate it, do my best. So,
And you almost have to hold that mic right up to your mouth.
okay, we'll work with what we've got. We had some technical difficulties that you saw in this presentation here. We'll have a horizontal stretch on it, whereas those folks at home apparently are seeing it perfectly. So I hope we can get this to work. So this first slide is from Dr. Robert Mace's collection of postcards from early Houston. And it's a picture of an artesian well down in Harris County. And there was a discussion earlier about water being free and all that good thing. And I think it's a good illustration of back in the day, in 1910 in this case, where water was wherever you could find it, no worries, no problems. And there it is. And let me ask you a question. Is there a single artesian well anywhere in this area? Well, we don't want water go. We've used it all, right? Okay. So this is what we're going to be talking about in a degree, and I'll try to show you what the outline is going to be on the journey we're going to take. We'll review very briefly the hydrologic cycle. Then we're going to come to a fork in the road, which is going to be driving a lot of the issues with water in Texas and in Montgomery County. But we're going to have to go back in time to understand some of the laws and ideas. Then we'll come back to that fork in the road and take the other fork and talk a little bit about science, groundwater management, the Gulf Coast Aquifer, and local groundwater management here in Montgomery County, and then I'll wrap it up with some points. So the hydrological cycle, basically, you pick any point in the cycle, and it just is an endless system of transferring water from one state to another. So we're starting with the ocean. Let's see. Hope you can see that. I'm talking to the people here in the audience. I'm using a laser pointer. The ocean, figuratively shown here, evaporation, cloud formation, which then can precipitate rain, which can infiltrate into the soil or run off back to the ocean. And this cycle is repeated over and over. So that, in a nutshell, which would normally take a few years to explain, is the hydrological cycle. So here's the core of the issue. We're going to try to get some ideas about, to think about. I'm not going to suggest I have the answer or any answer. It's just a whole series of questions. And the first question is, who owns the groundwater in Montgomery County, Texas? And so we're going to take the left fork in the road. You know, the Yogi Berra thing, you come to the fork of the road, take it. So we're going to take the left one. And we're going to be looking at the basis of water laws that we use today and some early ideas about groundwater. Then we're going to retreat back, take the other fork, where we'll talk a little bit about hydrogeology and water management. So one of the most important events occurred in 1904 on June the 13th, when the Texas Supreme Court affirmed the rule of capture. We'll go into what the rule of capture is. This was a piece of law adopted from English common law, and that was used in the Grayson County District Court. Grayson County is up just adjacent to the Red River, way up in North Texas. It was appealed, and then the Texas Supreme Court eventually ended up in the Texas Supreme Court, and we shall see what that was all about a little later in the presentation. So I told you we were going to go back in time. The ancients won. Well, that means there's going to be more than one. So Greek law and some scientific ideas that were developing way back thousands of years ago. But one of the most important ones was the concept of property, like that's mine, that's yours. This is a Western thing, if you will. In other societies, there are shared resources, and people don't make a claim to property as such. So keep that in the back of your mind. The other thing was the importance of writing. An oral tradition is simply not recognized. Things have to be written down. And that was the supremacy of law as it developed. Okay, what you also keep that in the back of your mind. Now, we have a picture of the guy at the top, Homer, at least that's what some people back then thought he looked like. He developed an idea of a groundwater source, Oceanus, and that's in his Iliad, his incredible poem of all the adventures out there in what was the Black Sea and the Aegean. Continuing on to another philosopher, Thales, he further developed that Oceanus idea, and he began to understand water being one of the four elements of the ancient Greek science view of the world. Great value on deep flowing water, and as is translated, all streams flow into the sea, and the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. So getting a basic concept of the hydrological cycle way back, over 2,500 years ago. Then Aristotle, and everyone's heard of Aristotle, he developed the condensation theory, again, a little bit more framework around the hydrological cycle, but his insight, and this is the critical one, rainfall alone is insufficient to supply the rivers of the world with water. I think there was some discussion, I came in around about 10 o'clock. There was some discussion of this aspect of it previously. So, fast, in a relative sense, fast forwarding to Roman law, and Roman law, as it turns out, forms the basis of much of the law of the Western world, and including property law. So again, in 450 BC, we had what's called the 12 tables, and part of that was considering what are the rights that are vested in land ownership, and what remedies are there for damage caused by water diversion, for example. And then there's the aqueductus. The Romans were famous for engineering, their engineering skills, moving water from one place to another. But those aqueducts had to be maintained. So who's going to pay for that? Water's not free, as we heard earlier today, and that was the case way back when. So getting closer to more modern times, so to speak, we had the Theodosian Code developed, and that was adopted by the Emperor Theodosius II in the Eastern Roman Empire. And this code is the first link we can actually show that establishes the link between water and property ownership. So now we had a wonderful event. The Western Roman Empire collapsed with the invasion of the tribes of Europe, and Justinian, over on the eastern side of the empire, reformed the legal codes, which were finalized in 533 AD. So the Justinian Code, and not going to go into this in very much detail, but really this is the whole basis of how we get our code, our legal definition of water and property ownership today. And a couple of key things to keep in mind. In this code, it says, in translation, a person who digs a well that cuts off water to a well in an adjacent property is not liable for harm. Most interesting thought. So, what this all about boils down to in the red box here, I'll read it out to you because I know you can't read it in the back. The combined legal code of Justinian negates action against a landowner for non-effective work, even if there is a loss of water from a neighbor's stream or well, or for other damages. So, you drill a well, you do something, free and clear. It don't matter. Is that clear to everybody?
Yeah.
So we will keep going. Oh, by the way, the picture is a 13th century illustrated manuscript in Latin of the Justinian Code, so-called Codex Justinianaeus. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Now we know where we're at. Everyone recognize the beast on the upper left. So the moderns, as I call them, Texas adopts English common law. Texas adopts, with respect to water and property, English common law in 1840. And as I try to go through history, I came across something odd. A complete translation of Spanish civil law was alleged not to be available. So the Texas Congress did what was, in quote, pragmatic, unquote. So English common law is central to today's legal issues with groundwater, as we'll see later. And why? Well, there was a gentleman in 1250, Henry de Bracton, who incorporated the Justinian law that we just looked at, where you can do whatever you want with water, basically. That now became part of English common law. And so court rulings in Texas really go back to 1250 because Texas adopted English common law with respect to water. But by the way, anybody know what a law is? Whatever you say it is, if you can keep people under control. Isn't it the basis of the American Revolution? So, okay, we're gonna look at an example from England, and this was 1843, the so-called Acton versus Blundell. Coal miner cut up water to a nearby mill, a cotton mill. There was some discussion about cotton earlier, so we didn't realize we were going to be talking about the same kinds of things. So what did the court find? The person who owns the surface may dig therein and apply all that is there found to his own purposes at his free will and pleasure. So absolute ownership of the water under a piece of land is affirmed here. So, and here's the next bit that's important. If, in the exercise of such right, he intercepts or drains off water collected from underground springs in his neighbor's well, this inconvenience falls within the description of damnum absque injuria, Latin for loss without injury. So as long as no one's killed in what you're doing, go ahead, do it. So now we come to the Supreme Court of Goliath. Similar case, Fraser versus Brown. And there are three really critical things that came out of this particular ruling. The law recognizes no correlative rights, whatever that means, in respect to underground waters percolating, oozing, or filtrating through the earth. Here's the one I really love. Underground water is so secret, occult, and concealed that any attempt to manage it would result in hopeless uncertainty. And finally, percolating water is to be regarded as part of the land itself, to be enjoyed absolutely by the proprietor within whose territory it is. So we want to try to unpack some of this stuff. So the whole idea about correlative rights is if landowners have properties overlying a common resource, which you would think would be aquifer, for example, they must limit their use of that water to a reasonable amount. This is the basis of what's called the American rule, or the rule of reasonableness. In other words, you're sharing resource. So we got to all participate in managing that resource appropriately. So in 1861, hydrogeology was still a work in progress, if you will. So in my way of putting it, the description secret, occult, and concealed is ugly paint at best and gratuitously ignorant at worst. But here's the important thing: the absolute ownership of groundwater of the landowner is affirmed. We're getting closer to home, but we gotta get through this whole thing. So Texas, Denison and the Paw Paw Formation. Here's a little advertising sign for Denison around the turn of the 20th century. The gates of come and secure health, wealth, and happiness come. Even back then, land speculators knew exactly how to lure people in. So the Gate City, the railway, cheap coal manufacturing, horticultural, and future commercial center of the Great Southwest. Dallas and Houston at the time, well, not really a big thing. Denison was going to be the center. It was an important railroad hub. The black lines you see in the diagram all run through this little town called Denison. And so the railroads, one of the requirements was that they were at that time steam trains and they needed water. So the Houston and Texas Central Railroad dug a 20-foot diameter well, 66 feet deep to a local aquifer. That's the Paw Formation. And then they started pumping 25,000 gallons of water every day. And a neighbor, Mr. East, his well dried up. So he sued. And that case ended up in the Supreme Court of Texas. And here is the result. Okay, here is the 1904 decision, and we saw the docket early on in the presentation. The Supreme Court cemented the foundation of Texas groundwater law, the rule of capture. Now, science wasn't still in the late 1800s. Geology was evolving more and more. Hydrogeology in particular was evolving more and more. But the 1904 Texas court still included the specific text, secret, occult, and concealed, directly quoting that ruling back in 1861 from Ohio. So now I hope you're starting to see the line that traces from the ancient Greeks through the Romans into the modern day. So, but what's very interesting about this, I think deep down, the Supreme Court, even back then, was a little bit concerned about their decision about the rule of capture. But in the absence of positive authorized legislation, almost an invitation for the legislature to create a law, but they didn't specify that law. What we have now is the law recognizes no correlative rights in respect to underground waters. So, and also the court, you've heard the word, the Latin phrase, stare decisis. So they were just going to follow what has been decided before. And I've seen two translations from the Latin. Let the decision stand, or we stand by our past mistakes. Good. Well, you can choose whichever one you want to think is the appropriate translation. So, excuse me, so this is number 6 water, by the way. I definitely did not buy an HEB. It's perfectly good water, as is all municipal water. Okay, so here we have is a map of the location in Denison where all this kerfuffle took place. Here is where the railroad company put its big well in. This shaded area is Mr. East's land right here, through which the Paw Creek ran. And then I've got concentric quarter circles here, 100, 150, 200, and 250 feet away from that railroad well. We don't really know which of these properties that Mr. East owned was actually the location of the well. But what I've got here is a diagram, if you will, going something like this. Here's the railroad well. Remember, it was a big well. This, by the way, in this tan color, is the Paw Formation, which is the aquifer that the railroad was looking for. And then I'm showing well location 100, 150, 200, and 250 feet away from the railroad, the big well, you're pumping 25,000 gallons of water a day. And then you can see if you pump so much, it won't take long. This blue line was where the regional water levels were apparently. It didn't take very long for Mr. East well to dry out, or the railroad well for that matter, because back in the time, I showed two maps. I pulled off the climatologist website, the Palmer Severity Index, which I think you're probably familiar with. But up in Grayson County up here, it was a severe drought in 1901, 1902 at this time, and the stream dried up. So the source of water filling the aquifer was limited. So there was two elements there, a drought and a giant pump. So this is an ancient history because we can go forward 95 years to a really interesting case where Ozarka, I think everyone has seen Ozarka water bottles at the HEB and elsewhere. They drilled some wells. We'll talk about this on the next slide. They drilled some wells. And two nearby landowners had an issue, and so they took Ozarka to court. And this case made it up all the way to the Supreme Court of Texas, and this ruling was made on May 6th of 1999. But in the meantime, as I was indicating, there were some concerns that the Supreme Court was about the absolute nature of the rule of capture. So in the meantime, they had ruled that the rule of capture is not absolute, but there are some limitations, and such as the malicious taking for the sole purpose of injuring a neighbor, drilling a slant well from your land into your neighbor's land, wanton or willful waste, or negligently causing subsidence. And I use the word negligently because it's important. These limitations are challenging to prove, but the landowner can still fully exploit groundwater, including selling rights to it. So if a landowner wants a big water bottling plant to be built adjacent to his property, he can sell the rights to the groundwater to that water company. So Henderson County is about east central Texas. Ozarka drilled these water wells and began pumping up 25,000, but 90,000 gallons of water per day, every day. And of course, the two plaintiffs, Mr. Cipriano and Mr. and Mrs. Fain, their wells all dried up. So this case went through, meandered through the courts, and starting in 1996, excuse me, and then ended up in the Supreme Court in 1999. So the Court of Appeals appeared to be sympathetic, and they wrote in their ruling, for so well settled law as the rule of capture, we conclude that it would be more appropriate for the legislature or the Supreme Court of Texas to fashion a new rule if it should be more attuned to the demands of modern society. Now, the Texas Supreme Court ruled against Mr. Cipriano and Mr. and Mrs. Spain, but they still quoted that statement. So here is where we're at today. The issue with groundwater. The core of the issue was then and remains now, should Texas abandon the rule of capture with limitations and instead adopt the reasonable use. And as was noted back in 1999, of all the Western states, Texas is the lone holdout for the rule of capture. Everyone else tries to work together if they can. The rule of reasonableness. So, to summarize, Texas groundwater law is based on English common law, and we've seen that direct line to the Justinian Water Code. The landowner has full rights to exploit such water with some limitations, as we discussed. Such rights are severable, though, meaning groundwater production rights can indeed be sold to others. So that's one side of the discussion. We'll go back to the other fork of the road now, and we'll do an introduction, and I mean this, an introduction to groundwater science. So this is a different kind of view of the hydrologic cycle, a little bit more detailed. And it talks of things like storage. The ocean stores water, albeit salty, but that water can evaporate without the salt, condense. Water becomes stored in the atmosphere. Eventually, it will precipitate out in the form of rain or snow. There's still storage of water up in the mountains, in glaciers and ice and so forth. But eventually, that ice and snow will melt and run down the streams and lakes where you can have evaporation, but some of this will infiltrate into the ground. This is the part we are really talking about right now. In the upland areas, some will infiltrate, come out of springs, into streams, into lakes, or eventually discharge into the ocean. But a big chunk of what is water, fresh-ish water, is in storage in the ground. So the question is, where is the Earth's water? So if we look at leaving aside for the moment, water in the deep interior of the planet, which we're not really talking about. This is water on the outside, the lithospheric part, if you will, of the outer crust of the Earth. So the oceans have nearly 97% of all the available water around the surface of the Earth. For all that, but fresh water is only 2.5%. And of that fresh water, we can see here in this next slide, and this, by the way, comes from the USGS. Glaciers and ice caps have nearly 69% of the water available. Groundwater, which is, this again is fresh water now, comprises about 30%, and lakes and surface water and streams, only 1% or so. So if we look at what is in this part, surface water and other fresh water, ground ice and permafrost occupies most of it, lakes, rivers, streams, living things, and the atmosphere. That is basically where we can have our sources of water to use from the surface. But here's another very large potential source of fresh water, groundwater. Now, I've heard it said, how do you tell the difference between a puddle on the ground and groundwater? Because both groundwater, right? Well, groundwater occurs in aquifers. And what I'm showing here is a section through a basin, the margin of the basin. In blue is where water may occur. The gray on this diagram are what are called confining units or aquicludes. In the upland area, there's a recharge, and then as we go from partly saturated to fully saturated, that's the interface forming a water table. Now, there are two kinds of aquifers present. One is confined, such as this one, which is confined on the top and on the bottom by impervious or layers that won't allow water to flow very easily. The second type is an unconfined aquifer. That's this one. It's not confined by any kind of aquiclude or confining unit. So it is then what we call a water table aquifer. Okay. Now, the confined aquifer can be artesian, as we saw in the postcard from 1910. And so that is due to this, the hydraulic head of the water table being way above the ground surface. However, in the case for a water table well, that the water will not be artesian. You'll have to work for it and pump it up. Now, of course, if you pump enough water or produce enough water, I should say, out of a confined aquifer, you eventually will depressurize that aquifer and will need to pump to obtain more of the groundwater that's available. So just a couple of definitions, if you will. What is an aquifer? It's a geologic unit that can store and transmit water. And commonly in our area, these are unconsolidated sand and gravel deposits, but there can also be more consolidated sandstone. And aquitards or aquicludes can transmit very slowly, but they don't store water. And these are generally shales and clay, very fine grained rocks. So to get a sense of how water moves through the aquifers, this is a good diagram from, again, from the USGS, where we have water in streams, rainfall, water eventually percolates down through the soil, forming a water table. And this, of course, again, is an unconfined aquifer. The water will flow through that aquifer in a very short time frame, relatively speaking, to streams. Or if there's a pump well, it'll be perhaps days from the surface to that well. Now, when we get down to the confined aquifer, as I mentioned earlier, these confining units will allow some transmission of water, but it's very slow. So in a confined aquifer setting, it'll be centuries and even millennia before water can reach that, recharge that aquifer, and eventually it can make its way back to streams and other locations.
May I ask you a question? How
Sure.
common is it geologically in an area where you have several aquifers below one another?
We live in that location. We'll get to that. It is common,
Okay, thank you.
quite common. And I've got a couple of diagrams that show you that.
Thank you.
Okay?
Mhm.
Right. Okay. The other thing, we talk about an aquifer, but what is an aquifer? Well, it's granular material and then void space or pore space. And the diagram on the left is one I enjoy. We have a cubic meter. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we'll talk metric for a little bit. Everyone comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay. We have a cube of dry sand, which is a meter cubed volume. And then we have a third of a meter of water. We add them together, and we don't end up with a volume of 1.3. Why is that? Well, this dry sand has pore space in it, and void space between the grains. And the water occupies those void spaces. So you end up with a saturated volume of sand, a meter, cubic meter of it. Okay. So in an indirect way, I've talked about how to calculate the porosity of that volume of sand. It's basically the volume of the voids, which is 0.3, divided by the total volume, and that's 0.3 or 30%. And this kind of thing is shown in this diagram where we've got a glass of gravel. We fill it with water, and then we end up with a saturated gravel. The amount of water that was added was 0.16 liters, again, metric. The volume of the glass, 0.577, and so we can get the porosity of that pack of gravel in the glass. And remember, porosity is completely occupied by water, is saturated. Yeah, I talked a little earlier about storage, groundwater storage, and there's a term for that, aquifer storativity. And in short, it's the volume of water which an aquifer releases per unit area, per unit drop in water level. And this is where the unconfined or water table aquifer and the confined aquifer part way in terms of how much water they can produce. And shown in this diagram, on the left, we have an unconfined aquifer, and groundwater is released from storage by simple dewatering. And the storativity is very close to the porosity of that particular unit. So here in this, you'll remember the porosity of that sand example we looked at was 0.3 or 30%. Here, this is how much water we can get out of unconfined aquifer in terms of storativity or storage coefficient. In contrast, if we have a confined aquifer, here's the aquiclude, aquitard on top. The storativity in this case is minuscule, 0.00005 to 0.005. We get relatively little water out. And in a confined aquifer, groundwater is released mostly by compressing the aquifer. So you might think to yourself, if I just finish the thought, if the aquifer compresses, what is going to happen at the surface?
Science.
Some science. You had a question?
Yeah, so is the storage coefficient directly correlated to the porosity of the aquifer?
Yeah, there are other elements, but I'll get to in just a little bit. Mostly permeability, we'll talk about that, and also the amount of hydraulic head. So we'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm glad you asked that question, because here we're going to talk about Darcy and Darcy's law. So Henri Darcy, was a French early hydrogeologist, I think you could probably say, and he published a book in 1856 about the public fountains in Dijon. Sadly, he just lived another couple of years after that. But in that book, he formulated Darcy's law, which describes the fluid flow, back to your question, in porous materials, and is indeed the foundation of modern quantitative hydrogeology. And this is him, and this is a picture of the front page of that book. So another fun diagram. We'll work through this together. So what elements go into our understanding of permeability in the subsurface? Well, the first thing in the diagram on the upper left is like a cross section through the earth, and it shows two wells, one on the left and one down here in this kind of a valley. And what it shows is where the water table is, there's a difference in the water elevation over this distance. And when you divide that difference in elevation by the distance, you get what is called the hydraulic gradient. So delta H over delta L. Now, the key thing is this: permeability is the ability of a sediment or whatever to transmit a fluid, in our case, water. So for a gravel, it's high permeability, lots of water come out, a sand, medium permeability, and then finally a low permeability, silt. So permeability has a big impact on how much water we can effectively get out of an aquifer. Now, what Darcy did was to build an experiment where he had a reservoir sitting up here, a tube of sandy material, and then a pipe leading to a measuring device where you could look at the volume that was produced. So he put in indicator tubes at the top and bottom of the cylinder gravel and measured the change in discharge as the hydraulic gradient changed. And so for a situation like indicated by 3 in the upper reservoir, there is the largest hydraulic gradient, the largest difference in elevation, and he plotted that, and then at the next 2 locations. So he ended up with 3 points through which you can draw a straight line, and he was able to determine that the discharge, and this is going back to, I guess, junior high math, plotting discharge against hydraulic gradient. You look at a straight line, there's a slope, and that slope is the constant of proportionality, in other words, permeability. And permeability has some really strange units. It's area. So you can go through that, the whole calculation. The reason I'm talking about this is that when we look at streams, we often think about, oh yeah, it rains and got a lot of water in the streams. But really, when you step back and look at how streams function, it's not quite as it would appear. Stream flow always gets our attention after we've had a big rain, because people's homes flood and potentially, and that often is well, that's a bad thing in and of itself, but worse things can happen. And so what I'm showing you here is one diagram of a long-term study that the USGS did of 54 streams in the US. And this is one stream, the Homachito, I guess that's the correct pronunciation, in Mississippi. And you'll see this is a logarithmic scale of flow in cubic feet per second in this particular river. So 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, so forth. And this is time in days over a year period. And you'll see 2 lines. One is a blue, spiky kind of a line. The other is it's somewhat spiky, but there seems to be a less extreme excursions in that particular discharge or the flow. So these spikes correspond to rain events, and surface runoff. But this, especially when you get down here, when there's been little or no rain, this is due to the contribution of groundwater to stream flow. And when we look, and I'll show you in a map in the next slide, when we look at these contributions of groundwater to stream flow, it's a very high range. In this analysis, 14 to 90%, with a median contribution of a little over half. So what I'm getting at, it's groundwater contributions to streams in this country is extremely important. And there was one critical factor. The permeability of the sediments underlying these streams allowed for this great variation in contribution to the stream flow. So here's the map I was talking about. These areas show major elements of watersheds that we can identify, and different areas of aquifer locations. So they are basically, because they interact differently with each other. And I've identified 3 wells: the Dismal River in Nebraska, circled here. Here's the state of Nebraska. The dry Frio River, down here in Texas. And then the river we just looked at, the Comachito down here in southwestern Mississippi. And so the blue in each of these little pie charts shows you the contribution of groundwater to stream flow. So the Dismal River up in Nebraska, it's 90% or thereabouts. In contrast, the dry Frio River, it's about 60%, and then the Comachito is maybe contribution of groundwater is maybe 40%. So you can see what a huge variation there is in the contributions of groundwater to stream flow. So the question?
As far as like development goes, the eradication of topsoil, does that increase or decrease the contribution of surface water to stream flow?
It would likely increase the surface runoff, so the floods would be more flashy.
And that's long-term contribution.
Well, that's a challenge, because what's likely to happen, there would be less opportunity for infiltration of the rain into the aquifer. So over a long period, we could well see a reduction in the groundwater, the capability of groundwater to supply flow to the stream.
Is that in turn lead to more intermittent streams and less perennial streams?
To what streams?
Intermittent versus
Oh.
perennial?
Yeah, we tend to think of intermittent streams as streams in the desert.
Okay.
So yeah, we're going to see an example of what happens though in a desert in a little bit. It's a great question of anticipation of what I would want to show you. Well, there's 2 examples I want to show you. One's from Arizona, the other will be from Texas. So we'll thank you for your question. So, and I hope I'm going to be answering it as we go through.
Is the Comachito part of the Mississippi River Delta?
I think it would probably flow into Mississippi, but I don't know the answer to your question.
Okay.
I think this is the boundary. I think this is the Mississippi River right here. So most likely it does flow.
I was thinking about the permeability of the underlying.
Yeah, well, see, there's a lot of clays.
Yeah.
You know, they don't call the Mississippi big muddy.
Right.
Yeah.
Which
so-
is not the case necessarily in the other 2.
Yeah, so up here, there's a lot of gravels and sands that are washed off the Rocky Mountains over geologic time. So in fact, there's a huge aquifer, the Ogallala.
Right.
Up, and this runs from the Panhandle of Texas all the way up through to South Dakota. So yeah, so that would be a contributing element for sure. Thank you. Okay, this is, excuse me. So this is where we can now talk about our contribution to what's happening with groundwater. The groundwater exploitation. You know, back in the day, people could dig hand wells and get a bucket of water at a time. Eventually, we came to a mechanical assisted device, a hand water pump, but still a limited amount of water. And then we went to the industrial scale of deep wells and huge submersible pumps and a really large output pipe. So I'm going to guess this must be 2.5 to 3 feet at least in diameter. So there's an issue with pumping groundwater because as we saw in our very first postcard slide, people think that back in the day, water is here forever, and that's not the case. Here is a graph of the cubic kilometers of water pumped out of the central valley of California, which is, I guess, one of the largest agricultural areas in our country for, you know, vegetables and fruits and such. The time scale runs from 1920 to about 2010. Oh, sorry, excuse me, 2015. So the amount of water that was pumped out, and you'll notice there's a lot more pumping during periods of drought. These little gray areas are periods of drought. Like here, for example, in the 1990s. I don't know if you were in California in the 1990s, but you know, you had signs everywhere not to take too long a shower and so forth. It's such a serious matter, and it appears they're back in that situation today. But the Central Valley had 140 cubic kilometers of fresh water was pumped out, which is approximately 4 full Lake Meads. Oh, and by the way, I think you've probably seen the what Lake Mead looks like now, given the prolonged drought that has been going on over the western states. And as I just mentioned, the amount of groundwater pumping is a lot higher during droughts than other periods. So normal year, total water use of groundwater, 29%, a dry year, 39%, and a drought year, 60%. So what does that mean? What it means is we are using a non-renewable resource. You know, that water is not returning at a time frame, in a time scale that we think is in the least bit sustainable. So I was getting to a couple of questions were asked earlier. So this is a slide showing groundwater depletion in the US. The red colors, the warm colors are showing the highest areas of depletion. I mentioned the Ogallala Aquifer, starting from West Texas all the way up to South Dakota. And there are a couple of different aquifers up there, but it has the most depletion up to possibly 400 cubic kilometers there's an aquifer in the Mississippi Valley where there's a lot of, used to be a lot of cotton grown, right? A lot of crops are grown there. There's an enormous amount of depletion. In Arizona, a desert. In this area, 50 to 150 cubic kilometers of groundwater has been extracted. And then here we are, the Central Valley of California. As I mentioned, it was 140 cubic kilometers. So that's that kind of an orange color. And you can see for the different aquifers, the relative amount of loss in water from these critical aquifers. So let's talk about the consequences now. Groundwater depletion. So we talked about soils and vegetation, permitting infiltration of water into, in this case, unconfined aquifer or water table aquifer. Now, if we put a pump in these aquifers, we can draw down the water table as groundwater flows in towards the pump. But look here, here's a stream, and the water will be flowing away from the stream into the ground to your pump. Here's an example of the groundwater level in Memphis, Tennessee over time. Feet below the land surface. Back in the 30s, it was maybe 60 feet or so, 70 feet below the water, the ground surface. And over time, as pumping went on, it then moved to around 140, 150 feet below the surface. And you notice this zigzag kind of appearance. Anybody have a thought on what that could be due to?
Seasonal rainfall.
Yeah, it's basically as wet and dry seasons. So summertime, you need to pull more water to irrigate your crops and so forth. Wintertime, it's the season, it's not the growing season. So it's the kind of, so the water table is going to rise because you're pumping less. Okay. So as we've just talked about, pumping of groundwater in excess of how much water is coming into the aquifer or recharging the aquifer will indeed cause water levels to fall. But here's the thing. So when we lose that water, the pressure in the aquifer decreases, and that will result in compaction of grains that make up the aquifer, especially in where we have clay-rich sediments. So here's a diagram of a conceptual aquifer where the clay grains are widely separated and partly supported by the pressure, water pressure. Here's a case where water has been pumped out, the initial conditions, a lot of water gets pumped out, then these fine grain layers begin to compact, the grains get rearranged because there is insufficient water pressure to keep them separated. So the land surface will start to subside. And there are multiple effects consequent upon that subsidence.
And you won't recharge it. It won't recharge
Yeah,
the way it would have.
right, if you're pumping in excess of the
Yeah.
recharge rate, correct. So, we talked about intermittent streams earlier on, and so we need to think about that. This is the Santa Cruz River near Tucson, Arizona. It's a photo from USGS in 1942. Lots of vegetation. You couldn't, it's still a desert area, of course. You can't see where the river is because it's in amongst all these trees. Same location, 1989. Lots of groundwater pumping, as we saw in that map earlier. All we see now is a sandy bottom. no vegetation, even though this is a desert. Remember, groundwater was feeding this river. It did not rely on rain. Rain, of course, in Arizona, very intermittent. You get the monsoonal rain sometimes, occasional flash floods, but that is it. Long term, this is the impact. The other thing that happens is regional scale subsidence. These three pictures are from the Great Valley of California. And here's a dog. Here's a fire hydrant. The dog is looking at the fire hydrant. I can't reach that fire hydrant. So this is a picture of Dr. Poland. He was a hydrogeologist in the USGS, and these are 10-foot marks. These are year marks. Let's see, 1925, 1955, and then this was taken in around the 1980s, I believe. So this was the original land surface in 1925, almost the height of a electrical power pole. And then here is a picture taken, let's see, between 1988 and 2014, the amount of subsidence that has occurred in the Great Valley. But also, and this picture is from Arizona, we can get faulting and ground fissuring, and then elsewhere, this is back to the Great Valley, a failure of infrastructure due to subsidence. And there are many ways of measuring subsidence. And one really useful technique is with satellites using radar, changes in the time travel between the ground surface and the satellite. And from that, you can calculate the amount of the speed of deformation of various locations. Now, here is, let's see, this is the southern San Joaquin Basin. So some of the areas you might be familiar with, Merced County, Kings County, for example, Kern County down here in the south. The warm colors show the areas of highest subsidence, and red is 250 millimeters per year. For reference, what, about 300 millimeters is about a foot. So it's a little under a foot, perhaps 8 or 9 inches per year. So there's two locations. One not quite as severe in the north, and the more severe one is in the south, where there are an awful lot of crops. Thirsty crops are grown. So this is, generally speaking, irreversible deformation. We can see from the time frame of 2015 to 2018, 3 years, we had, in one case, 600 millimeters or 2 feet of subsidence, and you can see here, there is no rebound, or perhaps even just a very slight rebound. So subsidence like that is a permanent feature. Here's the second example. Back to Texas. This is everyone remember 2011 or so, the drought? Yeah. This is the Brazos River up in Knox County. Knox County is up in this general area. I should have marked it on this map. But here's a map of the drought of 2011 from the USGS. It's this dark brown red over most of the state. Exceptional drought. And this is what an exceptional drought will do. The Brazos is a pretty big river. I mean, it starts in New Mexico and runs all the way across Texas. And, you know, you ever go on I-10, it's a good-sized river, but here it is. Dry as a bone, don't get your feet wet, going across the Browse House here. You know, one thing I've been trying to do some research for this presentation. It's an opinion, but Texas focuses on groundwater management only after crises. And those crises are invariably droughts, of which there are 4. The meteorological drought with diminished precipitation, agricultural drought, inadequate soil moisture, hydrological drought, and deficiencies in surface and subsurface water supplies because we're not going to recharge. And socioeconomic drought, that's more looking inward at ourselves. The quality of life and our health and our economy can be substantially impacted by this manifestation of drought. So, I don't know why that, I don't know how to change that on up here. So this is a timeline for the kinds of legislative actions that have been taken to manage water here in Texas. And most of them, and I've got a slide to show you a little later on, most of them are associated with following periods of drought. And we started in 1917, pardon me. A constitutional amendment was made to enable the legislature to develop laws for conservation and reclamation of water. WCIDs were authorized in 1925. The San Jacinto River Authority here it's in Montgomery County, but it also has an important function of supplying water down to all of the petrochemical facilities on the ship channel area. In 1949, water conservation districts, groundwater conservation district (GCDs) were created. The Texas Water Development Board was created in 1957, following what's called the drought of record in Texas. It's a long period in which a substantial part of Texas was in drought. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, was authorized in 1991. 1997, statewide regional planning groups, and we're in planning area H, if I recall correctly here. 2001, the voters approved the formation of the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District, which occupies the same area as Montgomery County. And then many of these GCDs and nearby counties were incorporated into groundwater management districts so that people could work out some common policies with regard to groundwater management. So for us, the 2 critical agencies that oversee all of the functioning of groundwater management and other kinds of management are the Texas Water Development Board. It has the function for water planning, financing, technical assistance, and also gathering data, which is critical. The TCEQ has a regulatory function, and that includes licensing, permitting, as well as monitoring and reporting. So for us here in Montgomery County, aside from the overview of Texas Water Development Board and TCEQ, the key agencies are the SDRA, and they are looking at way out into the future to assure a long-term water supply. And in some areas, they are providing wastewater service. And another function they have is for flood planning. GBA 14, Groundwater Management Area 14. The regional is for regional groundwater management. The Lone Star, their job is to preserve, conserve, and protect Montgomery County's groundwater. And the Harris-Galveston subsidence district prevents subsidence through, I left the word, it should be through groundwater management or replacement of groundwater with other sources. Let's say surface water. Yes.
In your introduction, you said that you were on the San Diego flood planning group, part of it, and also you sit on the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership. You have up there the San Jacinto River Authority as flood planning.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on the current proposed flood plan that they've been selling to the public regarding the trenching or the dredging of the Spring Creek and encasement concrete? Are you aware of that?
Okay, let's look at this. I don't believe that is a specific project that has had any feasibility studies performed on it. To give you the history, following Harvey, the group of 4 agencies, I believe it was, started the, I don't remember the name, but the San Jacinto Master Drainage Plan. And that basically looked at how can we manage water in what we would call the upper watershed. So a lot of Montgomery County, parts of North Harris County, basically in the watershed of the east and west forks of the San Jacinto River and all the tributaries that flow into those 2 main branches of the San Jacinto. So that study was completed in late 2000, was published in late 2000. The partners in that project were the Harris County Flood Control District, Montgomery County, the San Jacinto River Authority, and the city of Houston. The 4 partners. So, on that project, at a very high level, there were a number of projects that were identified as potentially being of benefit to mitigate flooding of a type similar to Harvey. In Spring Creek, 4 projects, if I recall, 5 projects. Spring Creek, 4 projects. 2 involving upstream temporary detention, and 2 channelization projects, which I think you're referring to one of them. To my knowledge, the only feasibility study that is underway by SJRA is in the 2 and I have I don't have any knowledge of any plans either to trench Spring Creek or line of concrete or anything like that.
Again, I don't know the total process, but based on what I've seen, it is one of the projects that they have, 2 retention ponds for reservoirs, the upper watershed of Spring Creek.
Right.
And trenching, and again, you said early on that deepening and straightening does not help pushing the project or the problem downstream potentially. It doesn't allow for water going into your groundwater. I'm just curious if you had any influence based on being on the San Jacinto Flood Planning Group and the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership.
Well, the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership is a partnership with Livingston Galveston Area Council, and it basically focuses on water quality improvement. So parts of that would include revegetation enhancement of the riparian cover, bagging, dog poop, you name it. There's a whole host of things to improve water quality in the watershed. On the other hand, and I use the term, set this into a regional flood planning group, and as I said, I'm in the upper watershed. I'm the upper watershed representative, and I can tell you that that is not on the list of projects that I've looked at to be done. So I don't know where the information is coming from. Oh, another hand.
There's another project of putting concrete, like a whole concrete pathway through the Spring Creek Nature Preserve, like the trail going from.
Oh, path. I thought it was.
No, okay, so the two different things.
Yeah, I'm just asking.
So-
As far as concrete.
Yeah, there's no feasibility study of any kind, as far as I know. And I can certainly check. There's a preliminary feasibility study underway for the two dry detention basins up in the Walnut Creek and Birch Creek. But I don't know of any studies of any kind in relation to what you're describing of trenching out Spring Creek. And I don't know where that information is coming from.
Been presented by the San Jacinto River Authority at public hearings over at Bob Fleming Park. I went to them.
On Tuesday.
Yeah, it's out there.
No, of course. What I'm saying to you is there's a whole slew of proposals that came out of the San Jacinto Master Drainage Plan, right? Okay. Including the what I mentioned about Spring Creek, the 4 projects that are being looked at. There are also, if you look at the whole watershed, I think it was a total of 16, I believe, projects, and very high level costs from about 3 billion to over 4 billion. So as far as I'm aware, there is no concrete proposal to trench Spring Creek.
Because when you're talking about a feasibility study, you're talking about like some part of an environmental impact statement or something.
Yeah,
So
there's
you're talking about where they are in the regulatory process, not that the project is on the list,
well,
right?
you have to, a project will never get on the list until you've done any kind of study such as you're describing. Yeah.
I didn't mean to derail this. I'll let you move on. I'll let you go.
No, I think it's a good question. And I was at, are you speaking about the meeting, Rob Fleming Park, just last week?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was organized by the San Jacinto Regional Flood Planning Group.
Again, they had it right there. Trenching Spring Creek, it's in writing.
Right, correct. And as I said, this is a whole slew of projects that are there, potentially. It doesn't say it's going to happen. There's a cost benefit analysis, there's environmental impact, there's a whole
There's a lot
host
of
of
stuff that
things
would have to be done first.
that have, yeah. I mean,
That's part of it.
as much as we would like flood management to move in an appropriate and fast manner, there's a whole slew of regulatory requirements over and above feasibility of actually being able to make a structure to do what it's intended to do without adverse consequences downstream. So the challenge is to get everybody on board to have input into the process. And I gave a presentation to Woodlands Green last week. Yeah, it was Thursday of last week. That the only way that flood mitigation projects that work will be through the involvement of everyone. That's it. Okay. if you don't get involved and something happens, well, you know, we need that input. And that input is, I love that kind of stuff. Now, we had 3 open houses, and I think we had a total of 64 people show up to that. So I hope that answers your question. But I'm saying to you that, yeah, that does not come of the San Jacinto Master Drainage Plan project, in which SJRA was a part. And there is a list of projects that are indicated there. Nothing to do with whether or not those projects would go ahead. We don't even know if the upstream detention project will go ahead at this point, because the study hasn't been completed. There's many steps along the way. Okay. All right. So. Okay. I mentioned about water planning. So under the oversight of the Texas Water Development Board, water planning goes through 5-year cycles for both surface water and groundwater, and actually all sources of water. And there's planning districts all the way through Texas. We're down here in Southeast Texas in region H. And then this is a look to the future at what the needs are going to be from, well, now it's a couple of years ago, but going out to 2070. So blue is irrigation, municipal is in red. They're the 2 biggest elements of needs for water, and the others are manufacturing, mining, and livestock, and so forth. Steam electric, basically power plants driven by natural gas, the cooling water. So you can see the biggest growth from our time, municipal needs, into the future, right there. And you'll see a slight decrease, projected decrease in irrigation. The question is, where's the water going to come from? Well, we also have not only surface water, but groundwater. That's also a 5-year planning cycle, a little bit different and out of phase with the overall water planning cycle. The areas of the groundwater management areas are also a little different. In this diagram, the dark lines are the boundaries of the groundwater management areas, and the shaded boxes, if you will, are the individual groundwater conservation districts that are part of the, and other districts that are part of the groundwater management areas. So the good news is, in terms of groundwater, there is a good availability, but over time, that availability is seen to decrease for reasons we discussed. Groundwater is not an infinite resource. It's once you've used it, it's gone. The only amount that can be go back into the ground is through recharge, and over time, that recharge is insufficient to keep groundwater availability or use that constant level. To get an idea of where our Texas aquifers are located, this is a map of all the different aquifers. We've already spoken about the Ogallala, shown here in the light blue. There are many aquifers. Ours, we'll see another diagram. Ours is the Gulf Coast aquifer. And this is where we'll get back to the discussion about aquifers overlying one another. There are multiple aquifers, the Carrizo, Wilcox, Trinity. These are mostly geologic or geologic related names, the Edwards Plateau, and so forth. These are the major aquifers of Texas. And this was from a publication, AgriLife publication. Took it out here, B6120.
And some of these areas simply have no aquifer.
Yeah, some areas have no usable water. Yeah,
Okay.
too saline, or the rock properties are insufficient to be able to produce sufficient water, but mostly it's the fact that there's not insufficient water in the rocks that are available. I mean, here, this is a Big Bend National Park.
Yeah.
It's a desert up there, so it's a challenge for water. But we are fortunate here on the Gulf Coast. So this is a close-up then of just the Gulf Coast aquifer, which is our source of groundwater. It extends from beyond the border of Texas, well to Louisiana and further eastward, and extends all the way down to the Rio Grande and beyond into Mexico. Now, there's two parts to this. One is they're separated by this dashed line. In the north, it's quite fresh, less than 1,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. But as we get down into the drier parts of Texas, it's slightly to moderately saline, over 100,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. So it's a little bit harder down there. But for most of this part of Texas, we've got pretty good quality groundwater. Again, coming closer to our area. This is Montgomery County, just north of Houston. The dashed line, we'll look at a geologic section showing the aquifers that overlie one another. But the different colors are showing the locations on the surface of where our aquifers are. And without going into the names, the aquifers are the Lissi all the way down to the Catahoula, but they're generally speaking poorly consolidated and can't compact if we overproduce these aquifers, particularly, as I've said before, the clay units. So back to your question. Here we have a cross-section that runs from northern Grimes County through Montgomery County to Harris, Brazoria, and up to the Gulf of Mexico. And in color here, there's the three aquifers that comprise the Gulf Coast aquifer. The Chico, on top, the Evangeline, there's a confining unit called the Burkeville, and finally, at the deepest part, the Jasper, which can include a small amount of the Catahoula. But so the pink are these very shallow surface layers that cover much of the region. So the Chico is generally not used a lot for municipal purposes. The two key ones are the Evangeline and the Jasper, in blue and yellow respectively. And you can see here the depths of the wells that you will need to drill, say here in Montgomery County. So the Evangeline, 500 feet, reasonable, but to get down to the Jasper, you're going to have to drill 1,500 to 2,000 feet. So that's a major expense to get there. So indeed, you do have, in our case, a water table aquifers, the Chico and the Evangeline, and then a confined aquifer, the Jasper, as it's beneath the Brookville confined area. Okay. So one question that I've always had, how fast does water naturally migrate in an aquifer? So I've taken the Jasper aquifer as an example, and if those are at home, you'll see a bunch of green circles, I hope, on this map. These correspond to the wells, ages of wells, ages of water in the wells in the table on the right side. The different colors correspond to the outcrop of the different aquifers. So up here in this tan is the Chico, the Evangeline, and then up here we have the Jasper outcrop. And so you can measure the distance from where the recharge of the Jasper occurs. There's an age of 13,000 years, not too far from the recharge zone. Down here on 59, the age of the water is 42,000 years. All these dates are based on USGS geochemical measurements. And so there are a number of different ages of water, ranging from 13,000 to 42,000. And we can measure the distance from the recharge in miles, and we can do a fairly straightforward calculation of what is the speed, how long will it take for a drop of rainwater, how fast will it take that water to get to that location. And so the range is 0.003 feet to 0.011 feet per day, averaging, as I show here, only 0.006 feet per day, which is, I don't think your hair grows that fast. I don't know, maybe it does. But it's, what I'm getting at, it's really slow. Once it gets in the ground, into the aquifers, it's moving very, very slowly. And here's another view of this, again, from the USGS, where they estimate the recharge, that's the vertical scale, in inches per year versus the age. Vertical is a linear scale. The horizontal scale is a logarithmic scale from 10 to 100,000. And so they have estimated recharge rates for the Chico in the red dots, the Evangeline in the green, yellow dots, and then the Jasper in the inverted dark red triangles. So we can see the shallowest aquifer has the youngest age of water, but commonly has the highest rate of recharge. Well, it's near the surface, so we might expect that. And if you go back and think about the diagram I showed you, showing the different overlying, aquifers overlying each other, that makes sense. And as we get deeper into the Evangeline, the water gets older, the recharge rates get lower in general, and finally, down here in the Jasper, it's the oldest water, and it also has the slowest recharge. Less than an inch, less than 0.2 of an inch a year. It's sobering to think about that when you're pumping the Jasper, that your recharge is so low. So the question is, what is going to happen with the water levels, for example, in the Jasper. And here we have a diagram. I got this information from the SJRA. What we're looking at is on the right, I'm sorry, the left scale, depth of water in feet from the surface. And then on the right side is the number of gallons per year, which corresponds to these heavy blue and red lines. This kind of spidery looking plot corresponds to the water levels measured in all these water wells in the woodlands that are completed in the upper Jasper. The blue line is the demand for groundwater, and the red line is the demand for surface water and groundwater combined. So it was recognized through this period that the water levels in the Jasper were falling, as you might expect, because demand was rising all the time. So this is, of course, here is 2011. If you remember, it was the year of the drought, and so water demand just skyrocketed. So people's yards should dry out. Non-native plants did not die. But following that, some conservation measures were instituted. And then in 2015, surface water from Lake Conroe became available, and the groundwater demand plummeted. And the total, what we're looking at here is the combined total ground and surface water in the woodlands. So in 20 years, over 20 years, there's about 12.5 feet per year of depletion of the water levels in the Jasper. And I want you to think back how much recharge per year, less than 0.2 of an inch. So the combination of conservation and with the surface water helped to stabilize these aquifer levels. Now, they're not totally bounding, at least currently they're relatively stable. Oh, and again, you'll see the seasonal effect when there's more demand, more pumping in the summer and less pumping in the winter, because people are watering their yards in the wintertime. And to talk about subsidence, we mentioned it a couple of times. So here is a measuring station, P013, that is run by the Houston Galveston Subsidence District. And it shows the subsidence over a period of from about mid-2000 or late 2000 to 2021. And the green line, I just trace the general sense of subsidence over that period. And if we look at just 2 periods, 2010 to 2019, there was 7 to 8 centimeters or a couple of inches, well, 3 inches or so of subsidence. But treated water became available in 2015. So you can see this trend is quite substantial in subsidence, but then it leveled off. Now in mid-2019, groundwater pumping increased, and then you can see the effect almost immediate on subsidence. So there's a take-home story here that if we don't allow our aquifers to recharge and we keep pumping them, the water levels will become lower, water pressures will decrease, causing compaction in the aquifer and consequently subsidence of the surface. So we need to have groundwater management, as we discussed previously, the groundwater management districts, groundwater conservation districts have been set up all over the state to manage our resources in the ground. So Lone Star in 2021, we mentioned this before, it has the authority to manage those resources. It's governed by a board of 7 elected directors, and also develops this 5-year plan for managing groundwater and sets up rules for groundwater users. As part of the whole planning process, the Groundwater Conservation District adopts desired future conditions in conjunction with the other groundwater conservation districts in groundwater management area 14. And that really is the foundational element of the groundwater management plan. So something that's important to know is that the process is controlled in essence by the Texas Water Development Board, because all of the groundwater districts must use hydrologic models that the Texas Water Development Board approves. So once that water management plan has been put together, it is reviewed by the Texas Water Development Board, and it is administered complete. And my apologies, that should be 54, it should be 4, but it was approved in 2020, in June. You never catch all the cycle, just a fact of life. So when we talk about conjunctive use, we speak of using all the available resources. So in our case, we've got surface water available in Lake Conroe. We also have groundwater. So, and we just used mostly groundwater up until 2015, and parts of southern Montgomery County are receiving water from Lake Conroe, as we saw that reduced the amount of groundwater withdrawal. Certainly in the woodlands, that's the only area I've updated for. So after the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District was formed, the board determined that a sustainable pumping rate was 64,000 acre feet per year, which means we could not exceed that, otherwise we would see substantial subsidence and less available water. So a plan to reduce groundwater use was developed by Lone Star. That reduction would have been 30% by 2016, meaning water utilities in the Lone Star Conservation District had to find alternatives. So SGRA then contracted for water in Lake Conroe. Now, Lake Conroe is a water supply reservoir for us here in Montgomery County, but also for the city of Houston. The city of Houston gets 2/3 of what's available. The third entitled to get 1/3. Okay. So that limits the amount of water eventually they'll be able to pull out of Lake Conroe, unless we have some agreement with the city of Houston to use more. So in 2011, SGRA finalized a groundwater reduction plan, or GRP, and contracted with all the utilities, public and private, that these utilities supply 80% of the water to Montgomery County residences and businesses. But this GRP includes the plan, or groundwater reduction planning includes a use fee, so-called GRP fee. And then with this plan in place, the SGRA constructed a surface water treatment plant and transmission lines, and all that work was done by 2015, as we saw earlier. Total cost for that, I believe, was on the order of $500 million, which was funded by Texas bonds, I believe, that are controlled by the Texas Water Bond Board. SDRA doesn't raise revenue by taxes or anything like that. It doesn't have that authority. So it has to, if it does big projects, it has to get the bonds approved by the Texas Water Bond Board. So,
Dr. Gaynor, I just want to point out, we've got about 10 more minutes.
okay, I'm almost done.
Okay, all right.
But I just want to make sure when we talk about some of the issues that we're dealing with, as we were discussing earlier about water, this is just a little overview. It's just a snapshot. It's the best I can do. But if I can leave stuff out,
It's a snapshot in time.
yeah. So anyway, basically, the cities of Conroe and Magnolia, even though they had signed contracts, they objected to paying the fees, and lawsuits began. They continue, and so forth. So basically, by 2019, after all these lawsuits went through the system, the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation Groundwater Reduction Rules were declared unlawful, void, and unenforceable. And so now the elected board is emphasizing private property rights. As we've seen in the past, that is the core, the rule of capture is where we're at, back to. So it's back to the future, if you will. So now we're looking at the potential for pumping 100,000 acre feet per year out of the aquifers in this area. And really, frankly, last comment here, it's just not clear what the path forward is going to be for combining surface and groundwater use here in this county. I don't really want to spend time on this because it will take, I'm running out of time, too long. Here is the story. If you look at the bottom one, Montgomery County, I got this from the SDRA, Montgomery County will have a water shortage without reserve supplies. In other words, we need to get surface water from various locations. These will be, if we do not get these extra supplies, we'll be long way short of our needs. The customer demand is this red line. The total county demand is the green line. So even if we pump 100,000 acre feet a year, it's still not enough water.
And conjunctive means
We're
pumping plus drawing from the lake.
using all available sources.
Okay.
And so this diagram is trying to develop the idea of what can be available groundwater, surface water from Lake Conroe, City of Houston. If we can do a deal with them, we might access some water. The Calahula, which is somewhat more saline, Lake Livingston, an expensive overland canal, return flows that come back to lakes, reuse, purple pipe, all that good stuff. Aquifer storage and recovery, ASR. There are multiple things that we can do in using all of the available sources of water together. So conjunctive use. This is the last slide. So these are measured words. So I just want you to know that groundwater management and ownership in Texas has a long and difficult history. If your rancher and your well runs dry at your spot because those Ozarka pumping their water to put into water bottles in supermarkets, you're out of luck. It's a shame. That's just the way it is. In our state, as we've discussed, groundwater is private property. but there's some limitations and some regulation on it. I just want to go back to those three words. Groundwater is not something that is secret, occult, and concealed. It's part of the hydrological cycle, and we understand it pretty well today. Overexploitation, as we've seen. Groundwater brings risks related to aquifer compaction, subsidence, and also faulting and fissuring and so forth, and water level lowering. So we saw rivers have some component of their flow coming from groundwater. If we lower the water table, that will lower the amount of water in the river. And also, if the water levels fall, we'll have to replace our wells. We'll have to drill them deeper, put bigger pumps in, and so forth. And we've seen, I hope I've been able to show you a number of different layers that Texas has for planning water. And the two main organizations that oversee the whole water management scene are the Texas Water Development Board and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They're critical. They are the two critical entities for us here in Texas. And then finally, in Montgomery County, so managing a clear path forward on how we go about managing our groundwater. I think it's going to continue to be challenging due to this established rule we have in Texas of the rule of capture, which has its origin in the dim, distant past. So with that, I thank you. And
Thank you so much. Okay, oh, wait. You have someone else? Okay, so, oh, yes, thank you. Okay, so a couple of things. Some of y'all have asked me where the YouTube stuff is, where these are posted. And it's on Heartwood's YouTube channel. And the way to find it is just to search on YouTube for Heartwood Chapter TMN. And it'll pull it up, and then you can just view any of the videos that are on there, whether it's one of these or the monthly meeting or whatever. Okay, and then the second thing is, hold on. Okay, well, that's all I got. Okay, I got an email from a friend that I know who works for Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it's to, I can't do this as a Texas Master Naturalist or as a Master Gardener, but a vote is coming up for the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Okay, so as a private citizen, I intend to write our Congressman Kevin Brady and send him something to ask for his vote yes on that. If there's anyone here who would like to contact me personally as a private citizen, I will give you my email address. And then I will send you the blurb that I got that I'm going to send to Congressman Brady. Deal? Okay, anybody who's interested, this is my personal email as a private citizen, and it is veggiegaltext@gmail.com. So Lisa Tuck, that's my name, everybody gonna know. Veggiegal, veggiegaltx@gmail.com. So veggiegaltx, all one word, @gmail.com. If anybody's interested, I'll send you the blurb. Yes, sir.
They talked about it a lot on last month's Human Tuesday.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay, did y'all hear that?
But
Last month,
they
Tuesday.
didn't provide, they didn't provide.
They didn't provide the blurb.
Watch
Okay,
the video recording of PMP that lays it all out.
okay, awesome.
But the blurb is a nice add-on to that.
Yeah, the blurb's nice out. This is what I'm gonna send to Congressman Brady. And it has, I'll just forward you stuff. Yep, as a private citizen. Okay, Anybody have anything else? Any questions? We good? Awesome. We'll see y'all in however many weeks. Okay.